Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now, whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment. I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. The house stood at the end of a quiet street, its tall, narrow frame hunched between two newer, brighter homes, like an old man surrounded by children. The paint was peeling. The wooden porch sagged slightly, and the windows seemed too dark, as if the glass itself had absorbed the years of shadows within. I should have known better, but moving here felt like a fresh start, a necessary change after everything I'd been through. A messy divorce, a draining legal battle, and the suffocating weight of a life I no longer recognized had left me desperate for escape. When I found this place, an old Victorian rental going for far less than it should, I didn't question it. A house this big, this close to the city, at this price, I took it before the landlord had a chance to reconsider. I should have reconsidered. I arrived on a damp October afternoon, my car filled with boxes and suitcases, my stomach twisting with equal parts excitement and exhaustion. The real estate agent had given me the key and little else. No welcome packet, no history of the home. Just a quick nod and a muttered good luck. That should have been my first clue. I stepped inside, inhaling the scent of old wood and dust. The air was thick, heavy in a way that made the back of my throat itch. The floors creaked beneath my sneakers as I walked through the house, taking it in. High ceilings, narrow hallways, an old fireplace in the living room. It had character, I told myself, charm, but something felt off. The silence was too deep, as if the walls were holding their breath. Shaking it off, I focused on settling in. I spent the rest of the day unpacking, moving furniture, and convincing myself that this was the start of something better. As evening crept in, a light drizzle pattered against the windows, and I curled up on the couch with a beer, letting the hum of the television fill the empty space. Then, around 11 p.m., I heard it, a sound from upstairs, a single, deliberate thud. I froze, my grip tightening around the bottle. The house was old, wood expanded, things shifted, noises happened. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just on edge from the move. But as I climbed the creaky staircase to check, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I found nothing, just my half-unpacked bedroom, the hallway stretching into darkness, and the faint scent of something stale, like forgotten fabric in an attic. I went to bed telling myself I was being ridiculous, but the house didn't let me sleep easy. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to a noise, a slow, rhythmic creak, like footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. The sound continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the hallway was empty, but the air was cold, too cold, and I could swear I smelled something faintly sweet and rotten, like flowers left to decay. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, after too much coffee and too little rest, I met my neighbor, an older woman, maybe in her late 60s, with kind eyes and a cautious smile. She introduced herself as Mrs. Collins, her gaze lingering on the house behind me. "You're renting that place?" she asked, a strange note in her voice. I nodded, rubbing the back of my neck. "Yeah, why?" She hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she said, "People don't stay there long." I frowned. "Why not?" Mrs. Collins glanced at the upstairs window, her expression unreadable. "Strange things happen in that house," she said. "Always have." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of things?" I asked, half hoping she'd laugh it off. She didn't. "Years ago, a man ran out of there in the middle of the night," she murmured. "No shoes, no coat, just ran. Said he saw something staring at him from the closet. He wouldn't go back in, left everything behind." I swallowed hard. "Before that," she continued, "there was a woman, lived alone, sweet girl, but she started hearing things. Footsteps, whispers. One night, she called her sister, crying, saying something was in the walls. She moved out the next morning. I forced out a chuckle, trying to keep my nerves in check. Old houses make noise. Mrs. Collins gave me a long look. "It's more than that." A gust of wind rattled the porch railing. Then, softer, she said, "Be careful." I watched her walk back to her house, my stomach twisting with unease. Maybe she was just trying to scare me. Maybe she believed what she said. Either way, I suddenly wasn't so sure about my decision to move in. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept telling myself it was just an old house, just the wind, just my imagination. But as I drifted into uneasy sleep, I thought I heard something, a whispering sound just beyond my door. And for the first time, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The gray morning light barely made a difference in the dim bedroom, and my body ached as if I'd spent the night wrestling with something unseen. My mind was sluggish, fogged over, like I had barely slipped beneath the surface of rest before something yanked me back. Maybe it was the stress of the move. Maybe it was the unsettling conversation with Mrs. Collins. Or maybe it was the whispering I thought I heard last night. I sat up, rubbing my temples, trying to shake off the heaviness clinging to me. The air in the room felt colder than it should. Not crisp, like fresh winter air, but stale, like something trapped in a forgotten basement. The house was still, too still. I pushed the thought away and forced myself out of bed. The hardwood floor was icy against my bare feet, and I winced as I made my way downstairs. Coffee first, then unpacking, then whatever normal people did in a new home. The kitchen was small but functional, with outdated cabinets and an old fridge that hummed loudly. I brewed a pot of coffee and leaned against the counter, staring out the window. A fine mist clung to the street outside, swallowing the tops of the trees. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I exhaled. I needed to stop this. I was psyching myself out. As I reached for my mug, I heard it, soft, distant, barely more than a shift in the air. A creak, not the casual groan of an old house settling. It was deliberate, slow, like someone stepping carefully across the upstairs floor. I froze, my fingers tightening around the handle of the mug. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The sound stopped. The silence stretched. I let out a slow breath and forced a chuckle. "Jesus," I muttered. "It's a house. Houses make noise." Still, I found myself gripping the edge of the counter like a lifeline. After a moment, I shook it off. No way in hell was I letting a couple of creaks scare me out of my own home. I spent the day unpacking, trying to bring some sense of normalcy to the place. I stacked books on shelves, hung up my coat by the door, and filled the cabinets with food I knew I wouldn't cook. As the hours passed, I almost managed to convince myself that the house wasn't strange, that it was just old and empty and unfamiliar. That illusion lasted until nightfall. It started small, a tapping sound, faint and rhythmic, coming from inside the walls. At first, I ignored it. Probably mice. Houses like this always had mice, right? Then came the footsteps. Not heavy or hurried, but slow, intentional, moving across the upstairs hallway. I stood at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. I wanted to believe it was my mind playing tricks on me. That exhaustion was twisting shadows into something they weren't. But when I stepped onto the first stair, the air shifted. It felt wrong, thick and heavy, like stepping into a room where someone had been standing just moments before. My breath came faster. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then a sound. Not footsteps, not tapping, a whisper right behind me. A single breath of sound, curling just beneath the edge of hearing. I spun, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. The living room stood empty. The dim glow from the streetlight outside barely making a dent in the darkness. I swallowed hard. Get a grip, I whispered to myself. You're losing it. I backed away from the stairs, retreating to the kitchen like a coward. By the time I went to bed, I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just a draft or the wind or my own paranoia getting the best of me. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing right behind me, watching, waiting, and in the silence of the house, I thought I heard it again. A whisper, low, faint, like something was saying my name. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. That presence lingering just beyond the edge of my senses, hovering in the dark. I told myself it was all in my head, but the whispering, that was real. I knew what I heard. By morning, my nerves were raw. The house was cold again, colder than it should have been. I shuffled downstairs, trying to shake off the exhaustion pressing on my shoulders like a heavy weight. Coffee. I needed coffee. I fumbled with the machine, my hands unsteady, my mind fogged over with lack of sleep. The kitchen felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, less watching. I almost managed to convince myself that last night had been a fluke. Then I saw the footprints. They trailed across the kitchen floor, faint but unmistakable, as if someone had walked barefoot through a thin layer of dust. The problem was, I had cleaned the kitchen yesterday, and I hadn't walked around barefoot. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. The prints led from the hallway into the kitchen, but they didn't lead back out. I forced myself to laugh. Okay, I muttered. Maybe I tracked something in and didn't notice, but I didn't believe that. Not really. I spent the next few hours trying to push it from my mind. I turned on the TV, let the background noise fill the silence. Tried to focus on anything but the creeping unease curling in my stomach. That's when I saw him. Through the front window, a man stood on the sidewalk, staring at my house. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, wearing a heavy coat and a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. His posture was rigid, tense, like he wasn't just looking at a house. He was studying it. I hesitated, then made my way to the door. By the time I stepped outside, he was already turning away. Hey, I called after him. Can I help you? He stopped but didn't turn around. For a long moment, I thought he was going to ignore me. Then, slowly, he turned his head just enough to glance at me over his shoulder. You live here now. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in a while. Yeah, I said, shifting uncomfortably. Just moved in a couple of days ago. He exhaled sharply through his nose, something almost like a laugh, but not quite. Did they tell you? A chill ran through me. Tell me what? He finally turned to face me fully. His eyes were dark, sunken, as if he hadn't slept in years. About her, the words settled heavily between us. My mouth was dry. Ooh. His gaze drifted past me, toward the house. His jaw tightened. It doesn't matter, he muttered. Then he shook his head. You should leave. I stiffened. Excuse me? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like he regretted saying anything at all. Look, just be careful, all right? If you hear her, don't answer. My pulse spiked. Hear who? But he was already walking away. Hey, wait a minute. I called after him. What are you talking about? He didn't stop. I watched him until he disappeared down the street. a growing sense of unease twisting in my gut. I didn't know what bothered me more, the fact that he clearly knew something about this house, or the fact that he looked so damn scared. That night, I kept every light on. I sat on the couch, the TV humming low in the background, my eyes darting to every shadow that stretched across the floor. Don't answer. That's what the man had said. But answer who? The clock ticked past midnight. I told myself I wasn't tired, that I was just being cautious, that I wasn't waiting for something. But then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the house exhaled. A long, slow creak traveled across the ceiling, like someone shifting their weight upstairs. I sat up, my pulse hammering. Then soft. So soft I almost thought I imagined it. A whisper coming from the hallway. My breath hitched. I stared at the dark stretch leading toward the stairs, my body frozen in place. The whispering continued, low, urgent. My name, a voice, just above a breath, calling me. Don't answer. The man's words came back to me, sharp and cold. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still. The whispering grew more insistent. Then footsteps, not heavy, not hurried, but deliberate, moving toward me. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, silence. I sat there, every muscle locked, every nerve screaming, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself to move. I crept up the stairs, my heart slamming against my ribs, and checked every room. Nothing. No signs of anyone. No open windows. No footprints. But as I stood in the hallway, listening to the unnatural silence pressing in around me, I felt it. A shift. Like something had been here. Like something had been waiting. And as I turned to head back downstairs, I heard it again. A whisper, right behind me. This time, it was laughing. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. I sat on my bed, back pressed against the headboard, staring at the dark corners of my room, waiting for something, anything, to move. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling remained. That thick, suffocating presence, like unseen eyes pressing against my skin. By morning, I was exhausted. My body ached, my head throbbed, and the cold that had settled into the house refused to leave. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just overtired. But deep down, I knew better. I needed answers. By noon, I was knocking on my neighbor's door. The old woman, Mrs. Finch, opened it just a crack, peering at me with sharp, knowing eyes. I was wondering if I could ask you something, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. She hesitated, then opened the door a little wider. Come in. Her house was the opposite of mine. Warm, cluttered, filled with the scent of cinnamon and old books. I sat on her floral-patterned couch as she settled into a chair across from me, her gaze steady. You want to ask about the house, she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. Her expression darkened. What have you heard? I hesitated, whispering, I admitted, footsteps at night, and I met a man yesterday. He said I should leave. Mrs. Finch sighed. That would be George. You know him? She nodded. He lived in that house years ago. Before him, another family, and before them, a young woman. None of them stayed long. A chill crept up my spine. Why? She hesitated. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. That house, it has a history, she said. An ugly one. I swallowed hard. What happened? She glanced toward her window as if someone might be listening. Then, finally, she spoke. Back in the 1950s, a man named Elias Wakefield built that house. Lived there alone. No family. No friends. People in town said he was strange. Always lurking in the woods. Always watching. And then one day he disappeared. Disappeared? I echoed. Vanished without a trace, she said. But the story started after that. People who moved in after him heard things. Voices, knocking on the walls, crying. Some even claimed to see him, standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep. My stomach twisted. Some say he was into dark things, she continued. Occult practices, rituals. People in town claimed he was trying to contact something, bring something through. And maybe he did. Maybe that's why no one who lives there lasts. I licked my dry lips. Did he leave anything behind? A journal? Notes. She gave me a long, searching look. You really want to go looking for that? I hesitated, but I had to know. I think I have to, I said. Mrs. Finch sighed again, shaking her head. If you're smart, you'll leave before it gets worse. I wished I could take her advice, but something told me it was already too late. That night, I searched. I started in the basement. It was cold down there, colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with the scent of dust and damp wood. I ran my hands along the stone walls, tapping, listening for hollow spots. Then, in the farthest corner, my fingers found something, a crack, a loose brick. My pulse quickened as I pried it free. Behind it, hidden in the wall, was a small leather-bound book, a journal. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I opened it. The pages were brittle, filled with Elias Wakefield's cramped handwriting. At first, it was just normal entries, mundane details about his days. But then the tone shifted. Asterisk, I hear them at night. Whispers from the walls, asterisk. They watch while I sleep. Asterisk, I must finish the ritual. I must open the door, asterisk. My breath caught. I turned the pages faster, scanning the words. Asterisk, I see her now. She stands at the foot of my bed, smiling, waiting, asterisk. She wants me to let her in. The words blurred as a cold gust of air swept through the basement, flickering the light. I froze. Then, from the darkness behind me, a whisper, low, laughing. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was here, watching, waiting, and I had just found the door Elias Wakefield had tried to open. I shouldn't have taken the journal. I knew at the moment I stepped back upstairs, the small leather book clutched tightly in my hands. The air inside the house felt different, thicker, heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I told myself it was just in my head, that I was sleep-deprived, my imagination running wild. But the feeling stayed. Something had changed. I set the journal on the kitchen table, staring at it like it might spring open on its own. The last entry burned in my mind. Asterisk, I see her now. She stands at the foot of my bed, smiling, waiting, asterisk. Who is she? I ran my fingers over the cracked leather cover. The pages inside were yellowed and fragile, filled with Elias Wakefield's cramped, desperate handwriting. I had barely scratched the surface. I needed to know more. I made coffee, forcing my hands to stay steady as I flipped to the next page. August 17th, 1952. The door is almost open. Asterisk, she is closer now. I feel her watching, asterisk. Asterisk, but something is wrong. The ritual, I didn't do it right. The air is colder. The voices are angrier, asterisk. Asterisk, I hear knocking at night. Sometimes it's on the walls. Sometimes the ceiling. Last night, it came from inside the closet, asterisk. Asterisk, she is waiting. I must let her in, asterisk. A loud thump echoed from the back of the house. I flinched, heart hammering. It had come from my bedroom. Slowly, I set down the journal and stood. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way down the hall, my breath shallow. I reached the bedroom door. It was open, just as I had left it. Inside, everything looked the same, except for the closet door. It was open, not wide, just a crack. But I knew for a fact I had closed it that morning. A sharp chill crept up my spine. I stared at the dark gap, my pulse thudding in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong with this house. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was just on edge. I kept busy, unpacking the last of my boxes, organizing shelves, anything to distract myself. But the feeling never left. And by nightfall, I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. I left the lamp on. I kept the journal next to me on the nightstand. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I drifted off. Thump. I woke with a start. The room was dark. Too dark. The air was thick, suffocating. I sat up, heart pounding. Thump. It came from the closet. I turned toward it, pulse hammering against my ribs. The door was open, wider this time. I stared into the blackness beyond it, my throat dry. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, a whisper, low, just a breath of sound, right beside my bed. My body went rigid. I wasn't alone. A shape moved in the dark, shifting just beyond the edge of my vision. The air turned ice cold, and suddenly I felt it. Something standing right there, inches from me, watching, waiting. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Then the bed dipped, like someone was sitting down. I felt the pressure beside me, the mattress sinking under an invisible weight. A sharp, icy breath brushed against my ear. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, asterisk, let me in. Asterisk, a scream ripped from my throat. I bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp switch. The light flickered on, chasing away the darkness. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. The closet door was closed. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in bed with the lamp on, staring at the closet, waiting for something, anything, to move. My skin crawled, every nerve in my body screaming that I wasn't alone. But the night stretched on in silence. The house felt wrong, like it was holding something back, waiting for the right moment to show me what I had let in. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I needed to get out. I threw on a jacket and grabbed my keys. My hands trembled as I locked the front door behind me, stepping into the early morning chill. The world outside felt normal. Cars passing in the distance, birds chirping, but I felt like I had stepped out of another reality, a darker one. I needed answers. I needed to know what Elias Wakefield had done to that house, and I knew exactly where to start. The library. The local library was small and quiet, the kind of place that smelled like dust and forgotten stories. I found the records section in the back, tucked between rows of creaky wooden shelves. The librarian, a thin woman with tired eyes, barely glanced at me as I approached. "Do you have any records on a man named Elias Wakefield?" I asked. She frowned. "Wakefield?" I nodded. "He lived in my house, back in the 50s. Recognition flickered across her face. "That house," she murmured, then gave me a careful look. "People don't usually go digging into that story." "I don't have a choice," I said. She hesitated, then gestured for me to follow her. She led me to a row of filing cabinets, pulling open a drawer filled with old newspapers and town records. After a few minutes of searching, she handed me a faded newspaper clipping. The headline sent a chill through my bones. "Local man missing. Strange discoveries in Wakefield House." I scanned the article, my pulse quickening. Elias Wakefield had vanished in 1952. No sign of struggle, no body. His house had been left exactly as it was, the doors unlocked, the furniture undisturbed. But the authorities had found something strange in the basement. Symbols, carved into the walls, burned into the floor, bloodstains. No one knew where the blood had come from, and no one could explain the strange smell that lingered in the air for weeks afterward. Something rotting, something wrong. The town eventually declared Wakefield dead in absentia, but rumors spread. People swore they saw him at night, standing at the windows of the empty house. Some said they heard his voice. whispering through the walls. The librarian watched me as I read. "You should leave that place," she said quietly. I swallowed hard. "I don't think I can." I spent the rest of the day digging through records, but there was nothing else. No explanation for what Wakefield had been trying to do. The only clue I had was his journal, and I knew I had to finish reading it. By nightfall, I was back in the house. I didn't want to be, but something pulled me back inside, like invisible strings guiding my steps. I locked the door behind me and turned on every light. The journal sat on the kitchen table, exactly where I had left it. I flipped to the next page, heart pounding. August 21st, 1952. She is inside. Asterisk, I let her in. I had to asterisk. Asterisk, she whispers to me now. She tells me things. Secrets. Promises. I see her in my dreams. Asterisk. I am not alone anymore, but I am afraid because she is hungry. A floorboard creaked behind me. I froze. The air turned heavy, pressing against my chest like a weight. Slowly I turned. The hallway light flickered. Then, just for a second, I saw her, a figure standing at the end of the hall. Tall, motionless, smiling, and then the light went out. Darkness swallowed the house, and I wasn't alone anymore. The darkness was alive. It wrapped around me, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood frozen in the kitchen, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The figure at the end of the hall was gone, but I knew she was still there, watching, waiting. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I turned on the flashlight. A thin beam of light cut through the blackness, but it didn't feel like enough. The shadows around me were too deep, too dense, like they had a weight of their own. I needed to move. I forced myself to take a step toward the hallway. The floor groaned beneath me, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The light flickered. My breath hitched. And then a whisper, soft, right behind me. Asterisk, you're in my house now. Asterisk, I spun, the phone slipping from my grasp. The flashlight clattered to the floor, the beam spinning wildly across the room before landing on. Footprints, wet, bare footprints leading from the hallway to where I stood. They hadn't been there before. I staggered back, my stomach twisting in knots. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The air in the house had changed, charged electric, like the moments before a lightning strike. Something was coming. Something was already here. I dropped to my knees, grabbing my phone. The light trembled in my grip as I swept it across the room. Nothing, but I wasn't fooled. I knew better now. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my bedroom, back against the wall, watching the door. The house was silent, but that didn't bring me any comfort. The silence was worse. It felt intentional, like something was listening. I clutched Elias Wakefield's journal in my hands, my fingers digging into the brittle pages. The last entry kept repeating in my mind. Asterisk, she is inside. I let her in, but I am afraid, because she is hungry. Asterisk, I wanted to believe this was just some lingering ghost story, some restless spirit repeating the past. But I knew better now. She wasn't a ghost. She was something else. And she was still hungry. By morning, I had made a decision. I was going to the basement. Every instinct in my body screamed against it. But I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Wakefield had done something down there. Asterisk open asterisk something. And I needed to know what. The basement door was old and warped, the paint peeling from years of neglect. It groaned in protest as I pulled it open. A wave of damp, stagnant air rushed past me. I swallowed my fear and stepped inside. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. The basement was deep, deeper than I expected. The air grew colder with each step, the light from my phone barely cutting through the thick darkness. At the bottom, the stone floor stretched out before me, and then I saw them, the symbols, carved into the walls, burned into the floor, twisting, overlapping lines that made my head ache just looking at them. They pulsed in the dim light, like they were breathing. A rusted metal chair sat in the center of the room. Ropes dangled from its arms. Dried blood stained the floor beneath it. My stomach lurched. Wakefield hadn't just invited something in. He had fed it. A cold breeze stirred the air, and I shivered. My breath came out in quick, panicked gasps. I needed to leave. Now, I turned and froze. The basement stairs were gone. The doorway was gone. The walls stretched into endless darkness. The symbols glowing faintly, pulsing with something alive. And then a voice, soft lilting. Asterisk, why are you running? Asterisk, the air turned ice cold. Shadows shifted in the corners of the room, gathering, moving toward me. I backed away, heart hammering, but there was nowhere to go. A figure stepped into the light, tall, unmoving, smiling. She was here, and she wasn't done with me. I couldn't breathe. The smile on her face stretched wider, almost unnatural, like the curve of her lips was too big for her face. Her eyes, asterisk dark, endless pits asterisk, stared at me with a hunger that went beyond mere physical need. It was a hunger that reached deep into the soul. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. My mind screamed for me to move, to run, but my body was frozen in place. The air around me felt thick, as if I was wading through it, each step heavier than the last. The shadows shifted, closing in around me, like they were alive. They reached for me, grasping at my legs, pulling me toward her. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. She stepped closer. The floor beneath her didn't creak. No sound at all. It was like she was floating, an ethereal presence that defied everything I knew. Asterisk, you're afraid, aren't you? Asterisk. Her voice was soft, almost soothing, but it cut through the silence with a cold edge. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask what she was, who she was, but the words stuck in my throat, choked by the pressure building in the room. I could feel it now, the weight of her presence, pressing against me like an invisible hand. Asterisk, why are you so afraid? Asterisk, she asked again, her voice a whisper, but the words rang in my ears like a bell. She was getting closer. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. Her breath, if it could even be called breath, was like ice brushing against my face. I recoiled, my back pressing into the wall behind me. Because I am not like you, I managed to croak, the words barely audible. She tilted her head, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, asterisk amusement asterisk, a spark of recognition. Then she spoke again, her voice like a gentle caress. Asterisk, we're all the same here, you know. We're all hungry. Asterisk, the ground beneath me shook. It was subtle at first, a low tremor that I felt in my bones. The walls began to ripple, the symbols on the floor growing, twisting like they were alive. They pulsed in time with the shaking, each beat louder, stronger. I could feel my heart in my throat, pounding against my chest as if it wanted to escape. Asterisk, what do you want from me? Asterisk, I gasped, my voice cracking. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached forward, her cold fingers brushing my cheek. You're already here, she said, her voice almost sad, like she had been waiting for me for a long time. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a way out of this. And then it hit me. The journal. Elias Wakefield had been obsessed with her, with the rituals, the symbols, the power that lived in this house. He had opened the door, let her in, and now she was here, waiting for me. I could feel her growing stronger, her presence filling the room, suffocating me. The walls pressed in closer, the symbols twisting faster. The shadows seemed to be reaching for me, their fingers long and gnarled, waiting. But then, something shifted. For a split second, I heard a noise, asterisk a door creaking star. A figure, someone or something, moved in the distance. A flash of light. I turned my head, desperate to see anything other than her. In that instant, I realized the truth. She wasn't alone. I bolted. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran. The stairs reappeared before me. The basement door, still open, like a portal to escape. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The house groaned around me, the shadows clawing at my heels, but I ran. My feet hit the floor with each step, the sound too loud in the silence. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stumbled into the hallway, my breath ragged, my chest burning. I didn't dare stop. The front door was right there, but it felt miles away. The house wasn't going to let me leave that easily. As I reached for the door handle, a chill swept over me. It was her again. Her voice. Asterisk, you can't run away. Asterisk. The door slammed shut in front of me, the wood shaking as though something was pounding against it from the other side. The house locked me in. I turned, searching for another way out. The walls seemed to close in. The air grew thicker, more suffocating. I could feel her presence everywhere. Asterisk all around me star. Whispers filled the air. Asterisk, you're already mine. Asterisk, I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But when I looked into the darkness, I saw her again. Her smile, her eyes, and I knew. She wasn't going to let me leave. I was losing my mind. I could feel the walls closing in tighter with every passing second. The house, asterisk this cursed house asterisk, had become a living thing. It wasn't just the cold air or the creaking of the floorboards anymore. It was in the shadows, in the very fabric of the place, twisting and turning until I wasn't sure where the house ended and the terror began. I could hear her, her footsteps, always just behind me. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was there, asterisk following asterisk, watching. It was as if she was always just a step away, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to ignore it, tried to block it out, but it was impossible. The whispers, her presence, it was relentless. The house had marked me. I couldn't escape it. The basement door was still open, the one place I hadn't dared to go. It loomed in front of me, a dark void in the middle of the hallway, pulling at my mind like some kind of magnetic force. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to uncover whatever lay behind it. But I knew that it was the only place where I could find the answers. I had to face it. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. The air in the basement was thick, almost suffocating, and the moment I stepped into the darkness, I felt it, the weight. It pressed down on me, as if the house itself were alive, aware of my every move. The stairs creaked under my weight, the wood groaning in protest. The cold from below wrapped around me, sinking into my bones. I couldn't breathe, but I had to keep going. I had to know. The light at the bottom of the stairs flickered, dim and sickly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. There was a strange smell down here, something musty, like old paper and decaying wood, mixed with a faint trace of something else, something metallic. I stepped forward, the floor beneath me sinking with every step. It was a long, narrow space. The air was thick with dust, and there was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the house. At the far end of the room, I saw it, the old workbench, cluttered with strange tools, things I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. But it wasn't the bench that caught my attention. It was the journal. I'd found it. It was just like the one in the attic, the one Elias Wakefield had kept. I grabbed it without thinking, tearing it open. The pages were yellowed with age, brittle, but still legible. The entries were erratic, hurried. They started with research, talks about rituals, strange symbols, just like the ones I had seen in the attic. But as I read deeper, I felt the weight of the words growing heavier. Elias wasn't just obsessed with the occult. He had done something. He had opened the door. I turned the pages faster, my heart pounding. The ritual was described in painstaking detail. There was something about the house, something about the land it was built on, that had drawn Elias in. He had used blood, dark symbols, and invocations. But the last few pages, those pages were the ones that made my stomach twist. They weren't written by Elias. They were written by someone else, someone who had been here before. The handwriting was different, jagged, almost frantic. The words didn't make sense. They were like warnings, begging anyone who read them to leave. Asterisk, it's too late. You're already marked. Asterisk, asterisk, the door cannot be closed. The curse cannot be undone. Asterisk, asterisk, she is coming for you. She is waiting. Asterisk, asterisk, you are the next one. You must never leave. Asterisk, I dropped the journal. It fell to the floor with a sickening thud, as if the very act of letting go had released something trapped inside it. The shadows seemed to stir. Asterisk shift star. I wasn't alone. I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were right next to me. I turned, my heart slamming in my chest, and saw her. She was standing there, her smile still stretching impossibly wide. Her eyes, those dark, hollow pits, locked onto mine. And in that moment, I realized she had always been waiting for me to uncover the truth, waiting for me to come down here, to see the journal, to understand. The house didn't want me to leave, and now it was too late. I felt it then, the pressure in the room, the weight of the curse settling around me, like chains around my body. The shadows closed in, and I could hear her voice again. Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk, she was right. I could feel the panic rising, but my legs wouldn't move. They were frozen, stiff, locked in place as if the house itself had a hold on me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my heart beat like a drum, thundering in my ears. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but the thought of turning away from her, of leaving this room, was far more terrifying. She was here now. She was real, and she would never let me go. The shadows around me seemed to grow thicker, closing in with every passing second. She was still standing there, smiling that sickening, wide grin, her eyes dark, unblinking, watching me. I could feel her presence pressing against me, a weight on my chest, a coldness that seeped through my skin and into my bones. I wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. She wasn't just a figment of my imagination anymore. She was real, and I was trapped in this house with her. I slowly backed away, but my feet caught on the floorboards. They creaked loudly, as though the house was laughing at me, mocking my every move. I stumbled, almost falling, but managed to catch myself on the edge of the workbench. That's when I saw it, the door, the one that led deeper into the basement, the one I had avoided for so long. But now, in my panic, it was all I could think about. If I could just get through that door, maybe I could escape. Maybe there was something down there that could help me. I turned and ran. The moment I crossed the threshold, a cold wind slammed into me, making me stagger. I could hear her footsteps now, louder, closer, right behind me. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, and I spun around, but it was too late. The room I had entered was different. Darker, colder, more oppressive. It looked like another part of the basement, but something about it felt wrong. The walls were lined with strange symbols, some carved directly into the stone, others painted in what looked like dried blood. The air was thick with the scent of something old, something decayed. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. The shadows seemed to be alive, twisting and writhing in the corners of the room, and I could hear the whispers again, the voices of those who had come before me. They were all around me, urging me to leave, to escape, but I couldn't. I was trapped. I stumbled forward. my eyes scanning the room for any sign of a way out. And then I saw it. The book. It was lying on a pedestal in the center of the room, its pages open, as though waiting for me. I could feel it pulling me toward it, drawing me in like a moth to a flame. I didn't want to go closer, but my feet moved of their own accord. As I neared the pedestal, I felt something brush against my skin. A cold hand, light as air, but unmistakably there. I gasped and jerked back, my heart skipping a beat. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the shadows, creeping at the edges of my vision. I reached for the book. The moment my fingers touched the pages, the world around me seemed to go black. I could hear her now, her voice rising, becoming louder. "You should have never come here," she whispered, but her voice sounded closer. The ground beneath me began to tremble, shaking violently, and the shadows swirled faster. I could feel the air thickening around me, as though something was pushing against me, something dark, something powerful. My head spun, and I staggered, almost falling into the book. But before I could even touch it again, the room shifted. Asterisk moved asterisk, and everything around me started to twist, to distort. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me. But there was no way to escape. Then I saw her. She was standing in front of me, but she wasn't smiling anymore. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as she stepped closer. Her hands were outstretched toward me, fingers curled like claws. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and the more I looked at her, the more I realized she wasn't fully human. Asterisk no. No, no, no. Asterisk. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My body wouldn't move. She was so close now. I could feel her cold breath against my face, could feel the chill of her skin. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I thought she was going to drag me into the darkness with her, Asterisk, the door behind me, burst open star. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. The room seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't hear anything anymore except the sound of my heart pounding in my chest, the rush of blood in my ears. I didn't dare look behind me. I didn't want to see her chasing me. I didn't want to know that she was there, just waiting for me to turn around. But when I reached the stairs, I stopped. There at the top of the stairs, standing in the dim light, was the shadow of a man. He was tall, thin, and his features were hidden beneath a hood. But there was something so wrong about him. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my legs felt like lead. I had to get out, had to leave. But the shadow in front of me, Asterisk, it wasn't letting me go, Star. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I couldn't move. The figure at the top of the stairs was all I could focus on, its dark presence consuming the small light in the hallway. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Every instinct told me to flee, but the sight of that shadow, still and unmoving, rooted me to the spot. The air in the hallway grew colder, heavier. It was as though the house itself had come alive, wrapping its cold, suffocating arms around me. The walls seemed to close in, and the dim light flickered above, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters. It was all so wrong, so wrong. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words caught in my throat. The only sound was my own breath, shallow and panicked, filling the space around me. I felt a bead of sweat slide down my temple. Despite the chill in the air, the figure didn't move, didn't speak. But then in the stillness, I heard something else, a soft scraping sound, like fingers dragging across the wood, followed by a whisper, low, faint, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The voice was so familiar, yet so foreign. It was hers, the woman from the basement, the one who had haunted me since I first stepped foot in this place. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, swirling around me like an invisible storm. I turned my head slowly, but there was nothing there, no sign of her, just the emptiness. the chilling silence that followed her words. The figure at the top of the stairs took a step forward. I gasped and stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the wooden floor as panic surged through my body. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I thought it might burst. The figure moved again, this time with purpose, its movement slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, but the stairway felt like a trap. The figure seemed to be waiting, as if it knew I couldn't move, knew that I was caught in the web of this house. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like someone walking behind me, getting closer with every step. My breath caught in my throat, and I dared not look back. The feeling of something breathing down my neck, of something following me, crept up my spine like ice. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs shaking uncontrollably beneath me. One step, then another, each one a struggle. My body was screaming at me to stop, but I kept going, ignoring the panic, ignoring the chill of the room closing in. The footsteps behind me grew louder, the presence of whatever was following me growing more oppressive with each passing moment. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, their groans echoing in the hollow silence of the house. I made it to the first step, then the second, my feet finding their way in the darkness. I didn't dare turn around, but just as I was halfway up, I felt it, a cold hand, light and chilling, brushing against my back. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. The figure at the top of the stairs was gone. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just the house playing tricks on me. Maybe I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that whatever was haunting this place wasn't done with me. It never would be. I reached the top of the stairs, my chest heaving with panic, but I didn't stop. I wasn't safe yet. The door to the living room was ajar. I had to go through it. I had to leave. But as I approached, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, standing just beyond the door, was a figure, a man, or what was left of one. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His mouth was agape, as if he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. His hands were stretched toward me, fingers twisted in a grotesque, unnatural way. The man had been in this house before. He was just like the others. He was a victim of the curse. I backed away, the blood draining from my face, but the figure didn't move. It didn't have to. The moment I stepped back, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping me in this room with the others. Suddenly, a loud thud sounded from behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing, just a silence. Then I heard it again, another thud, closer this time. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stared at the door. The doorknob turned, slowly, and then it opened. A cold wind rushed through the crack, as if the house itself had exhaled. The door creaked open fully, revealing only darkness beyond. I stepped backward, but my foot hit something solid, a chair. I looked down and saw something that made my stomach turn. Scratches, deep gouges in the floorboards, as if something had been dragged across them, leaving behind a trail of blood. The room was no longer empty. The shadows seemed to come alive, creeping toward me, stretching out like long, gnarled fingers. I could hear whispers again, louder now, a chorus of voices, some pleading, some laughing, some just crying. I turned and ran for the door, my legs moving without thinking, each step more frantic than the last. The shadows reached for me, but I slammed the door behind me, blocking them out. I thought I was safe, but I knew I wasn't. I had only bought myself a few moments, and when I looked back toward the hallway, I knew I was running out of time. Story 2. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I mean, moving into an old, creaky house in the middle of nowhere wasn't exactly part of my plan after the divorce. But here I was, standing on the front porch of a house that looked like it had been stuck in time. The white paint was chipped, the steps were uneven, and the overgrown garden seemed to mock the whole idea of having a yard. Still, the price was right, and I needed a fresh start, somewhere far enough from the reminders of my old life. The door creaked open with a groan as I pushed it, stepping inside. The air was thick, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. Dust motes danced in the streams of light coming through the half-drawn curtains, and the floors, aged and warped, sighed under my weight. I set my boxes down and walked through the rooms, mapping out where everything would go. At first, I didn't mind the noises. The house had character, and I was used to it. I'd always lived in older places, and the occasional creak or groan from the wood was something you just learned to live with. What really caught my attention, though, was the smell. It was faint at first, like old would mix with something metallic, almost like rust. But it lingered, like a shadow in the back of my mind. I wasn't entirely alone in the neighborhood. There was an older woman across the street who'd been watching me move in. She waved as I walked out onto the porch, and I waved back. Her name was Mrs. Green, and she wasted no time in coming over to introduce herself. "New here, are you?" she asked, eyeing me carefully. "Yeah," I said, trying to smile. "Just moved in. It's a bit old, but it's got character." Mrs. Green tilted her head, her eyes narrowing a little. "Character, eh? Well, I suppose that's one way to put it." She glanced at the house like it had secrets it was trying to hide. "You might want to be careful at night. The last tenant, well, she didn't last long. Said she heard footsteps, strange noises, a lot of stuff like that. Ended up running out of here one night, screaming something about a curse. No one's quite sure what happened, but she never came back." I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush it off. "Curses? Yeah. I think I'm just looking for a quiet place to get away from everything." Her eyes locked onto mine for a second too long, and then she nodded. "It's a funny place, this house. Full of secrets. Just keep an eye out for things that don't add up, all right?" I promised I would, but her words lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the ramblings of an old woman trying to spook me. That night, I went to bed feeling unsettled. The house groaned and creaked, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. But that wasn't what kept me awake. It was a sound. It started with a slow thud. I lay still in bed, listening. Thud, thud, thud. I thought it was just the house settling. Nothing unusual. Then it came again, louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. The heavy sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, as if someone was pacing upstairs. I froze, holding my breath. The house was old, sure, but the footsteps didn't feel right. They didn't sound like the usual creaks. They had weight to them, like something solid and heavy was moving around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I waited, listening for more, but there was nothing. I got up and checked the upstairs rooms, but they were empty. The house was silent. I chalked it up to my imagination. Too many nerves from the divorce, too many unfamiliar surroundings. The next few nights, the footsteps returned, always late at night, when the house was at its quietest. The sounds were just a little too deliberate to be the house settling, but I convinced myself to ignore them. It was just a weird, old house. Nothing more. I had hoped the noises would stop after a few days, but they didn't. Each night, like clockwork, the footsteps returned. Sometimes they were slow, dragging across the floorboards above me, like someone was pacing in a circle. Other times, they were quick and sharp, as if someone was in a hurry, moving frantically from room to room. By the end of the week, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept more than a few hours each night. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves adjusting to the new place, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I began to feel a growing unease every time I walked through the hallways, as if something was watching me. The air in the house felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. It wasn't until I met my next-door neighbor that I started to think there might be more to this house than I had realized. His name was Tom, a middle-aged guy who had lived in the neighborhood for years. He seemed friendly enough when we crossed paths in the yard one afternoon. I decided to ask him if he knew anything about the house's history, maybe to find some rational explanation for all the strange things happening. "Do you know much about the place?" I asked casually, trying not to sound too eager. Tom paused for a moment, squinting at the house across the street, as if he was weighing his words carefully. "Not much, but, well, let's just say people who live there don't usually stay long." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Tom glanced over his shoulder, then lowered his voice. "The last people who lived there before you, they left in a hurry. I heard them running out one night, yelling about something, said they saw things that weren't there. One of them, a woman, she started babbling about a curse, said the house had memories, bad ones. She wasn't the only one either. The people before her, same thing. It's like something in there doesn't want anyone to stay." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "A curse?" Tom nodded, his eyes flicking nervously to the house. "I don't know the details, but I've lived here long enough to hear the stories. You get used to the noises, the strange stuff. You can hear it at night, sometimes, like footsteps, dragging sounds, whispers. It's like the house is alive and it doesn't like visitors." I tried to laugh it off, but the unease was growing inside me. "I guess it's just the age of the house, right?" Tom didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me seriously. "Maybe, but I wouldn't stay too long if I were you." I walked back into my house, feeling a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Tom's words lingered in my mind as I went inside, closing the door behind me. The footsteps returned that night, louder than before, and the air seemed colder, too. I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was imagining things, or if the house really was alive, as Tom had said. That night, the door to the bedroom creaked open on its own. I had locked it earlier, but now it stood ajar, just wide enough for a sliver of darkness to seep through. My heart raced, and I was frozen in place, unable to move or call out. I could hear the heavy breathing, the soft rustling, just beyond the door. I didn't know what it was, but it felt wrong. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I held my breath. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and slowly approached the door. As I reached for the handle, the sound of footsteps came from the hallway, not from the upstairs. No, these were closer, right outside my door. I opened it with a shaking hand, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. But when I looked, nothing was there. The hallway was empty. I sighed, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's just your imagination," I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, I knew deep down that I was lying. Something was happening in this house, and I had no idea what. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The house felt colder, even in the afternoon, and no matter where I went, I had the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was more than that. The air seemed heavier, charged with something that made my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself. I went to the local store and picked up some supplies, hoping the fresh air and the bustle of the town would clear my head. But when I returned, the house greeted me with that same oppressive silence. I hadn't had a chance to look through all the rooms properly when I moved in. Most of the boxes were still unpacked, and I'd left several areas unexplored. The upstairs was mostly bare, with only a few pieces of furniture left behind by the previous tenants. I had avoided going into the back rooms, where the floorboards creaked the most. But today, I decided it was time to confront whatever was lingering there. As I opened the door to the first room, I noticed something strange. There, on the floor beneath the window, was an old wooden chest. It was tucked away in the corner, half hidden by dust and cobwebs. I hadn't seen it before. It must have been pushed out of sight by the previous tenants. My curiosity got the better of me, and I kneeled down to open it. Inside, there was a stack of old books, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. But the one that caught my eye wasn't a book. It was a thick, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, and the pages inside were filled with hastily scrawled handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel the weight of it, as if I had just discovered something I wasn't meant to find. I flipped it open to the first page, the words barely legible in places but clear enough to read. The handwriting was erratic, as though the writer had been in a hurry. Asterisk, I don't know what I've done. I thought I could control it, but it's too late. The rituals, they work, but they take a toll. It's opening something we shouldn't have touched. I can hear it now at night, whispering, calling me. It wants in. It's already here. Asterisk. The page trembled in my hands, and I glanced around, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I continued reading, my eyes scanning the next few pages quickly, desperate to understand more. Asterisk the house. It's never quiet. It was never meant to be quiet. The walls have ears. The windows have eyes. The ritual, I performed it wrong. I didn't realize the cost. They warned me, but I didn't listen. Asterisk. The handwriting grew more frantic as the entries continued, describing strange occurrences in the house. The writer spoke of dark shadows moving at the edge of their vision, voices whispering from empty rooms, and a growing sense of dread that gripped them at night. I could feel the panic in their words, the fear of something unseen but ever present. Asterisk, I tried to leave. I packed my things, but the house won't let me go. It knows what I did. It's too late for me. Maybe it's too late for everyone who comes after me. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be real. It had to be some elaborate joke or an old tenant who had lost their mind. But as I stared at the journal in my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was true. The footsteps, the whispers, they were all connected to this, to whatever the previous owner had done. I shoved the journal back into the chest, locking it away and pushing the chest back into its corner. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. I needed to leave, to go back to the safety of normal life. But something kept me there. Something in the house wouldn't let me go that easily. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time, they were different. They were closer, too close, and they didn't stop. They moved through the house, slow and deliberate, pausing in front of my door, then dragging themselves down the hall. The floorboards beneath my bed creaked as something, or someone, stepped lightly, as if testing the ground. I held my breath, listening. Then I felt it. A cold, chilling breeze washed over me, even though the windows were shut tight. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the sensation of something or someone sitting at the foot of my bed consumed me. My heart raced, my body frozen with terror. The feeling lasted for what felt like hours, but I couldn't bring myself to move, to look, to do anything but lie there, trembling in the dark. Finally, the coldness receded and the house fell silent once more. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. And in the morning, when the light finally came, I made up my mind. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening in this house, even if it meant going further down a path I wasn't sure I could return from. The morning after that chilling experience, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something I didn't fully understand. My body felt heavy, like the air itself had weighed me down overnight. Every creak of the house seemed louder than usual, more pronounced, as though it was aware of my presence, aware of my every move. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the journal. Its pages haunted me, gnawing at my thoughts. Whoever had written it had been desperate. Fear had bled through every word, and as much as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't deny the connection to the strange events that had been happening since I moved in. I had to go back to the chest, I realized. The rest of the journal might hold the answers. Answers I wasn't sure I wanted but knew I needed. The chest creaked as I opened it again, the smell of old wood and dust making me gag. I pulled the journal out, my hands trembling. The pages seemed to pulse with energy, as though they had absorbed the fear and darkness of the house. I flipped through them quickly, desperate to find more, but the words were scattered, disjointed. The writer's fear was palpable, their descent into madness clear. I stopped when I reached a section that seemed to describe something more specific. Asterisk, the ritual requires the blood of the unwilling, a sacrifice. It must be done on the 7th night, under the light of the full moon. Only then will the door open. Only then will they come. Asterisk, my stomach lurched. The words seemed to burn into my mind as I read them over and over. The door? What door? And who or what was coming? I scanned further, trying to make sense of the twisted sentences. It was clear now. The previous owner hadn't just been experimenting with the occult. They had been trying to open something. Something dark. Asterisk, I thought I could control it. I thought the house would keep the door closed, but I was wrong. Now it calls to me. It doesn't care if I'm ready. It will come whether I want it or not. Asterisk, I dropped the journal, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent again, but I could feel something lurking beneath the stillness. The air was heavy, thick with a presence that wasn't mine. I backed away from the chest, my eyes flicking nervously to the corners of the room, half expecting to see something lurking there, watching me. The ritual, I thought. The full moon. It was only a few days away, and that meant they would be coming. I didn't know what to do with this information. I couldn't let myself get lost in these superstitions. There had to be a logical explanation. I'd been living in the house for weeks, hearing the strange noises and seeing the odd things, but I had been dismissing it all as old house quirks, the wind, my imagination. But now, I wasn't sure anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about what Tom had said. How people always left this house in fear, how they ran from it, desperate to escape. What if it wasn't just a house settling or old pipes or drafts? What if something real was here? Something alive? I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to find more answers. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't just sit back and wait for whatever was coming. I needed to face it head on, even if I wasn't sure what it was. I spent the evening pacing through the house, trying to gather my thoughts. The house felt different tonight, more oppressive. The usual creaks of the floorboards seemed amplified, each one a reminder that I was not alone. When I walked into the living room, I noticed something strange, a shadow moving across the wall, stretching out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, but the room was empty, the shadow gone. I tried to rationalize it. It was just the light, the way the curtains swayed in the breeze. But my skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, lurking in the dark. Around midnight, I ventured back to the chest, pulling the journal out once more. The clock on the wall ticked ominously, each second echoing in the silence. I flipped through the journal, scanning for any mention of how to stop the ritual, how to seal whatever door had been opened. But I found nothing. The pages were filled with the writer's increasingly frantic attempts to understand the darkness that had taken root in the house. But there was no solution, no way to reverse the damage that had been done. Suddenly, I heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from the hallway. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It sounded like a whisper, but there was something wrong with it. It wasn't a voice, not quite. It was more like a growl, a vibration in the air that made my teeth ache. I dropped the journal, rushing to the hallway. The air was cold, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath. I turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark, but there was nothing. No source for the noise, no sign of movement. But then, as I swept the beam across the walls, it stopped. There, in the far corner, I saw it, a faint, glowing outline, something just beyond the edge of the beam. The shape flickered, barely visible, like a shadow caught in the light. Before I could react, it was gone. I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My pulse raced, and my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. The house felt suffocating now, like it was closing in on me, forcing me to confront whatever dark force had been unleashed. I had no choice but to face it. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was following me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadowy figure, its hollow eyes, its twisted grin. Even in the daylight, I felt like something was watching, waiting for me to slip up. But I couldn't just leave. I had a life to rebuild, a future to focus on. I had to go back. I wasn't sure if I was being brave or stupid, but I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting that house, or it would consume me. I couldn't live in constant fear of what I might find lurking in the dark. I made up my mind. I was going to return and end this. The drive back to the house was a blur. My thoughts were clouded with dread, but also determination. I had to figure out what was really going on. Why had the house chosen me? Why hadn't it let me go the first time? When I finally arrived, the house stood just as it always had, silent, looming, and seemingly indifferent to my presence. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding like thunder in the stillness. As I walked toward the front door, I felt an odd sensation, as if the very ground beneath me was alive, pulsing with energy. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. It creaked open slowly, and I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt heavier than it had the last time I was here, thick, oppressive, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. I could hear the whispers again, but they were faint this time, as though they were coming from far away. Still, they made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my head, but either way, I had to push forward. I made my way up to the attic once more, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. This time, I knew I couldn't leave without answers. The journal, the book of rituals, they were all clues, fragments of something bigger, something I couldn't quite grasp yet. As I reached the top, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small wooden chest tucked away in the corner, almost hidden behind the books. My heart skipped a beat. I had to know what was inside. The chest was old, its surface scratched and worn with age. I knelt down, fumbling for the latch. My fingers trembled as I opened it, and inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small, leather-bound book, much like the journal I had read before. But this one was different. It was thinner, almost delicate, and the pages inside were written in a script I didn't recognize. I turned the pages carefully, scanning the strange symbols and notes. The more I read, the more I realized that this was no ordinary book. This was the key to the house's curse. It detailed rituals far darker and more complex than the ones I had seen before. There were references to sacrifices, to binding spirits to the land, to making deals with forces beyond comprehension. But one passage stood out, an entry about a door that could never be closed. A door to another realm, a place where darkness thrived and where the spirits of the dead could be summoned at will. The passage spoke of a final offering, something that had to be given to ensure the door would remain open. My heart sank. The house, the rituals, the whispers, it was all part of this. The curse wasn't just about the house. It was about the door, the doorway to something far worse. And now, I understood why the figure had spoken to me. I slammed the book shut, but it was too late. I felt it. Something was here. I turned around, and there, standing in the doorway of the attic, was the figure again. It was more solid this time, more real. I could see its features clearly now. Its skeletal face, the long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. It took a step forward, and I backed away, my heart racing. I needed to get out, but before I could move, I heard the voice again, the same cold, whispering tone. Asterisk, you should have never come back. Asterisk, the figure's grin widened, and I could see something behind it. Shifting shapes, shadows moving in and out of focus, like 1,000 eyes watching me, waiting. The air was thick with malevolent energy, and I could feel the temperature drop again, colder than before. The whispers intensified, now coming from all directions. They filled my ears, growing louder and louder until I couldn't think straight. My mind felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the noise, the pressure of the unseen forces closing in. I reached for the door, desperate to escape, but the figure blocked my path, moving impossibly fast. It was in front of me before I could even react. My breath caught in my throat as I backed up, bumping into the chest. The shadows around me seemed to reach for me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to be closing in, the house shrinking around me, its dark presence swallowing everything. The whispers were deafening now, a maddening chorus that echoed in my skull. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure stopped. It tilted its head, its hollow eyes boring into me. For a moment, there was silence, an awful, suffocating silence. "You are too late," it whispered. Asterisk, the door is open. You cannot leave. Not now. Not anymore. Asterisk, the air crackled with energy, and I could feel the floor beneath me shift, as if the very foundation of the house was coming undone. I had no idea what to do. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on my fear, pulling me deeper into its web. I turned and ran for the stairs, my heart racing as I heard the figure following me. The house groaned and creaked with every step, the walls shifting, changing. I stumbled down the stairs, almost falling as I reached the bottom. The door to the outside was in sight, but it seemed farther away than ever before, as if the house itself was stretching the distance. I reached for the door, pulling it open with all my strength. But when I stepped outside, I froze. The world around me was wrong. The sky was a sickly shade of gray. The trees twisted and malformed. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting, like it wasn't solid anymore. I looked back at the house, and for a brief moment, I saw something terrible. A figure standing in the window watching me. But it wasn't the same figure. It was different. Its face was no longer just a shadow. It was a mask of pure, unfiltered evil. And then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. The darkness that enveloped me was not the peaceful kind, not the kind that lulls you into rest. It was thick, suffocating, as though the very air was alive with malevolence. My eyes fluttered open, and I was greeted by an overwhelming sense of disorientation. I wasn't in the house anymore, or maybe I was. The lines between reality and nightmare were blurring, and I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The ground beneath me felt soft, like wet earth, and the cold air bit into my skin. I tried to move, but my limbs were heavy, as if I were submerged in thick, murky water. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fought to take in a full breath, but it felt as though something was pressing down on me, holding me in place. I slowly rose to my feet, the ground shifting beneath me with every step. It was then that I realized where I was, or at least where I thought I was. I was back in the house, or something that looked like it. The walls were warped, twisted, as if the house itself had been distorted by some force beyond comprehension. The air reeked of decay, of mildew, and something worse, something that made my skin crawl. I looked around, but there was no sign of the figure, no whispers, just an eerie silence that felt wrong. I moved cautiously, my every step echoing in the unnatural stillness. The house was familiar, but nothing was right. The furniture, the paintings, the windows, they all looked off, like faded memories or distorted reflections in a funhouse mirror. I stumbled down the hall, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. Every room I entered seemed like a shadow of its former self, blurry, distant, and increasingly alien. As I passed through the hallway, I heard a faint scratching sound from behind one of the doors. A scuttling noise, like something crawling on all fours. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The sound was getting closer, closer still. I darted into a nearby room, slamming the door shut behind me. The room was dark, and I could barely make out the outlines of furniture. The air was thick, almost oppressive. My hands were trembling, but I had no choice but to gather the little courage I had left. Whatever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone until I faced it. I walked further into the room, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The walls were covered in strange symbols, like the ones I had seen in the book, the rituals. My fingers brushed over one of the symbols, and a sharp chill shot through my body. I recoiled, stepping back, but the chill didn't dissipate. It lingered in the air, hanging like a shadow, waiting for me to do something. That's when I saw it, a flicker in the corner of the room, a faint light, barely visible in the darkness. I moved toward it, drawn by something deep inside me, something that I couldn't explain. As I approached, the light grew brighter, more defined. It was coming from a crack in the wall, a thin line of illumination, as if something or someone was trying to break through. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the crack. The moment I made contact, the entire room seemed to tremble, like the house itself was alive. The walls groaned and the light grew blinding, forcing me to squint, to shield my eyes. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, like a distant thunderstorm vibrating through my bones. Then a voice, a whisper, asterisk, you shouldn't have opened it, asterisk. The voice was not the figure's voice. This voice was colder, deeper, more ancient. It sent a jolt of fear through me, like ice water coursing through my veins. I stepped back, my body frozen in place, as the crack in the wall widened, revealing a swirling black void. It wasn't just a hole in the wall. It was a doorway, a portal to something else. I could feel the pull of it, the beckoning force drawing me in. It was as if the very fabric of reality was tearing open, revealing a terrifying abyss, a place that shouldn't exist. But I couldn't look away. My mind screamed at me to run, to flee, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in the gravity of this strange, dark pull. I could hear whispers again, but they were different this time. The voices were in pain, full of desperation, and the sound of them clawing their way out of the void was maddening. Some part of me wanted to reach out, to touch the darkness, and see what lay on the other side, but another part of me knew that doing so would be my end. Come to me, the voice whispered again. Asterisk, let the door open wider. Step through. Join us. Asterisk. Suddenly, the room began to shake violently. The floor cracked beneath me, splintering like fragile glass. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as the walls twisted, contorted, and the air thickened with the scent of death. I was losing control, losing myself to this madness. I turned and ran, my legs shaking, my mind screaming for me to get out. The hallway stretched impossibly long before me, the walls narrowing, the air heavy with the stench of rot. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, clawing at my sanity. I could feel the pull of the void behind me, its presence relentless, but I couldn't look back. I couldn't stop. I burst through the front door, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat, my heart thundering in my chest. The house loomed behind me, silent once more, as if it were waiting, watching. The sky above me was dark, clouds swirling in unnatural patterns, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift as if I were standing on the edge of something far worse than I could comprehend. But I didn't care anymore. I ran until my legs gave out, until I could no longer breathe, until I collapsed onto the cold ground. The whispers still echoed in my ears, but I couldn't understand them anymore. I was too far gone. And then, just when I thought I was safe, I heard it again, the voice. Asterisk, you can't escape. It's already begun. Asterisk, The sun had barely risen when I found myself standing at the edge of the house, staring at it as though it were a living, breathing entity. The morning light did nothing to dispel the fear that lingered in my chest, the unease that had become a constant companion ever since I first stepped foot inside. I should have left. I should have packed my things, called a moving truck, and never looked back. But there was something about that place, something that kept pulling me in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the worst of it yet, that I hadn't yet uncovered the truth, and that the house itself wasn't done with me. I had to know what was happening. I spent the entire day wandering, almost aimlessly, around the house. The garden was overgrown with thick, twisting vines that seemed to move on their own, creeping along the edges of the walls like tendrils of some unseen force. I couldn't help but feel as though the house was watching me, studying my every move, just waiting for me to make a mistake. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the strange occurrences, the noises, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched, were just the product of an overactive imagination. But every step I took brought me closer to something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't ignore. By the time evening came, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to leave until I had answers. The journal, the rituals, the dark history of the house. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to know why this house seemed to be pulling me in, why I felt as though I couldn't escape its grip. I headed inside, the creaky wooden door groaning in protest as I pushed it open. The familiar musty scent of old wood and mildew hit me immediately. But this time, something else was there. Something wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as though it had absorbed every whisper, every scream, every breath of the past. The house felt more alive than ever. I walked through the darkened hallways, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was as though I were walking through a dream, each room more distorted than the last. The paintings on the walls had changed again. Their colors faded, their shapes warped, as though they were trying to break free from the frames that contained them. And then I heard it, a soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, like the faintest scrape of metal against stone. It was coming from upstairs. My heart jumped in my chest and I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came again, louder this time, like footsteps dragging across the floor. Heavy, deliberate steps. I stood frozen for a moment, weighing my options. The logical part of me screamed that I should run, that I should leave the house immediately. But the other part, the part that was drawn to this place like a moth to a flame, told me to keep moving forward. With trembling hands, I began to climb the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, but the noise only seemed to blend with the strange rhythm of the footsteps above. My heart raced, and I could feel the air growing colder as I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched out before me, long and narrow, the doors to the bedrooms lining both sides. But there was one door at the end of the hall, one door that seemed to beckon me, to pull me in with an invisible force. The footsteps stopped. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The silence felt suffocating, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to open the door. I couldn't help myself. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the grimy window. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. It looked like any other room. Old furniture, dusty curtains, a forgotten bed with a sagging mattress. But then I noticed something on the floor. A book. The journal. I stepped into the room, my breath coming faster now, and crouched down beside the book. It was open, as if someone had been reading it. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the pages, and the moment I touched it, the temperature in the room dropped. The cold wrapped around me like a vice, and I could hear a low, guttural whisper in my ear. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow. Just the empty room and the whisper that seemed to hang in the air, lingering like smoke. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, desperate to understand. The journal was filled with strange symbols, hastily scrawled notes, and descriptions of rituals. Rituals that had been performed in this very house. Rituals that had been designed to open a door to something beyond. The last page was different from the rest. It was covered in dark, uneven handwriting. The ink smudged as if the writer had been trembling when they wrote it. Asterisk, the door is open. There is no going back. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a house. It wasn't just an old, creaky building with a dark history. This place was a doorway, and whatever had been unleashed here was still waiting. I had to leave. I had to get out. I turned to leave the room, but as I stepped toward the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone or something was following me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. I didn't need to see it to know that I wasn't alone anymore. The door slammed shut behind me, and the house groaned, its walls trembling as if it were waking up. I ran, but it was already too late. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door, my heart thundering in my chest like a drumbeat. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, echoing through the house, slow and relentless. My breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale mixing with the musty, damp air around me. The house felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl, its walls pressing in on me, its creaks and groans louder now, almost like a warning. The door was locked. I fumbled with the handle, my hands slick with sweat. The sound of those footsteps, no, not footsteps, shifting things, scraping something across the floor, grew louder. They were closing in and I couldn't breathe. Finally, the door opened with a violent pull, and I stumbled out onto the porch, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't stop. I ran, not looking back, the gravel biting into my shoes as I fled toward the street. My car was parked in front of the house, but I didn't even think about it. I just kept running, down the long driveway and toward the safety of the neighborhood, toward the light, toward the noise, toward anything that wasn't that damn house. But even as I ran, I could feel it. The house was still there, looming behind me like a shadow, its presence clinging to me like a second skin. It wasn't just in my mind, it was real. I could feel its weight on my back, pressing down on me with every step. I didn't stop until I reached the corner, my legs aching, my chest burning. I stopped there, panting, and looked back. The house stood silent and dark under the night sky, its windows like empty eyes staring out at me. Nothing moved, nothing stirred, but the air around it was thick with something I couldn't explain. I didn't know where to go, what to do. I could call the police, but what would I say? That the house was alive? That I was being hunted by something I couldn't see? No one would believe me. Not now. Not after everything I had experienced. So, I did what I always did when I was lost. I drove. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to leave. I needed distance. I needed to escape the weight of that place, the memory of those whispers, of those footsteps that I could still hear in the back of my mind. I kept driving, passing streetlights and houses, the world around me spinning as I tried to clear my head. But the further I went, the more unsettled I became. The farther I got from the house, the heavier the silence felt. It was like it was following me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I could feel the pressure building inside me, a pressure that made me want to scream, to shout at the empty road, to do anything to break the tension. Then I saw it, a figure, standing by the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I skidded to a halt. My heart stopped. The figure stood motionless in the darkness, a silhouette against the dim glow of the streetlights. I could barely make out any details, just the outline of a person, standing there waiting. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't even roll down the window. I just stared, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, its presence so cold and unsettling that I couldn't take my eyes off of it. And then, the moment I looked away, it was gone, vanished, like it had never been there. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. The unease still gnawed at me, a growing sense of dread that filled every inch of the car. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of any of this. Was it the house? Was it something else? Or was it just my mind breaking down under the pressure? I didn't know. I just knew that I couldn't go back. I turned the car around, my heart pounding as I drove, but as I passed the spot where I'd seen the figure, I swore I saw something move in the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow. I wasn't alone, and as I drove, a thought struck me, a terrifying thought. What if the house hadn't been the problem? What if it had been the door that had been opened, the rituals that had been performed? What if it wasn't the house that was haunting me, but something else, something that had been set loose and was now following me, waiting for me to make the next move? I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to believe it. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I knew the truth. The house had never let me go. The terror I felt as I drove back toward the safety of the city was nothing compared to the terror that awaited me when I went home. The house wasn't done with me. It was waiting, patiently, silently, just out of sight. And it wasn't going to stop until I did something I couldn't undo. I pulled into the parking lot of a nearby diner, my fingers shaking as I turned off the engine. I had to stop. I had to think. I had to figure out what to do next. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back there. Not yet. The diner was warm, a small sanctuary away from the cold night that seemed to be creeping into my bones. The hum of the fluorescent lights above, the clink of cutlery, and the murmur of conversations created an odd sense of normalcy, something I desperately needed. But despite the comfort, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That thing, whatever it was, hadn't let go of me. It was still out there, waiting. I sat in a booth near the back, too jittery to sit still, my hands fidgeting with the edge of the napkin dispenser. Every few seconds, my gaze flicked to the door, half expecting to see someone or something standing just outside, watching me. But nothing ever came. The place was empty, save for a few scattered patrons who seemed oblivious to the weight of the night. I ordered coffee, though I couldn't remember if I'd even drunk the cup in front of me. I hadn't eaten all day, and now my stomach was nothing but a knot of tension. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't even remember when I last felt safe. The house, it was still on my mind. My thoughts kept circling back to it. The house, the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had all started with that damn door. The strange feeling that had come over me when I first stepped inside. The cold that had seeped into my bones. The constant watching presence. Was it just my mind breaking under the strain of too many sleepless nights? Or was there something more? Something I hadn't fully understood yet? As I sat there, the door to the diner swung open, a gust of cold air rushing in with a figure in a long coat. For a moment, I thought it was him, the man who had stood by the road earlier, but I quickly realized it wasn't. It was just a man, ordinary in every sense. He glanced around, his gaze briefly meeting mine before moving on. I quickly looked away, suddenly self-conscious, like I was being caught in some terrible act. I rubbed my eyes, willing myself to focus. The man moved to the counter and took a seat, his presence entirely unremarkable. But as he sat, something shifted in the room, a strange tension filling the space, as if the walls were closing in. I blinked and glanced up at him once more. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at something on the other side of the room. No, not just staring. Asterisk watching star. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my throat tighten. There was something wrong with the way he was sitting, as if he was waiting for something or someone. His fingers twitched, as if they were drawn toward some invisible thread. Suddenly, I had the overwhelming feeling that he could see me. No, not just see me. He was aware of me in a way that no one should be. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart skipped a beat. I stood up before I even realized it, instinct pulling me toward the door. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. As I reached for the handle, I turned one last time, and for a fraction of a second, I saw it. A glimmer of something unnatural, dancing behind the man's eyes. A cold, empty gaze that seemed to peer straight through me. My pulse quickened and my stomach lurched. But the moment passed. He blinked, and the strange look was gone. He was just another patron in the diner again, eating his meal, completely unaware of the storm that had been brewing inside me. I didn't wait for another second. I pushed open the door and stepped back into the night. It felt like I'd been walking forever. The streets were deserted, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep moving. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, of the house, the man, the whispers. What did it all mean? Why was this happening to me? But it wasn't just that anymore, was it? It was the door. That cursed door. The idea hit me all at once, like a punch to the gut. What if the door hadn't just opened a way into the house, but into something else? Something that was now following me? Something that had been awakened by whatever the original owner had done? I couldn't shake the image of that man in the diner, staring at nothing with that hollow look in his eyes. It was as though he knew something I didn't. I stopped abruptly, the feeling that I was being followed pressing against me. I glanced over my shoulder. No one was there, but I felt it. Something was behind me, closing in. I shook my head. I had to be imagining it. I started walking faster, then running, my breath coming in short bursts as I turned the corner and headed toward a park. The silence of the night was suffocating, and the more I tried to focus on my surroundings, the more everything seemed to blur, like I was trapped in a dream. Suddenly, I froze. A loud bang echoed from behind me, a sound so forceful I could feel it in my chest. My heart skipped, and I whipped around, looking for the source. Nothing, just the empty street, the eerie silence, and the feeling that something was there in the darkness. I didn't wait for anything more. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, but even then, something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck were still standing, my pulse still racing. I slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, I just stood there listening. The silence in the apartment was deafening, and I was afraid to move, afraid that I might hear something. But there was nothing, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the beating of my own heart in my ears. I glanced around, feeling like something was watching me. I thought I saw something shift in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving in the doorway of my bedroom, but when I looked, nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The door had been opened, and now it wasn't done with me. The hours ticked by in a haze. I tried to settle into some form of normalcy, but it was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, sent me spiraling back into the dread that had gripped me ever since I'd stepped into that house. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to distract myself. I made some coffee, sat on the couch, and turned on the television. The familiar hum of the screen, the lifeless chatter of a news anchor, was supposed to ground me, but it didn't. The silence of the apartment, even with the TV on, felt thick, like something was lurking just beyond the reach of the light. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and I hadn't slept in days. The exhaustion was wearing me down, but sleep, it felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door, the dark wood, the intricate carvings, the way it beckoned me. Every time I tried to forget it, the house pulled me back in. I stood up abruptly and walked to the window, trying to shake the feeling of claustrophobia that was closing in on me. The night outside was cold, the streets empty except for the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. But in the stillness, there was something else. A whisper, soft but unmistakable, reaching out from the darkness. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper, I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, clear as day, like someone was calling my name from just outside the building. I froze, staring at the darkened street below, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Nothing. I shook my head. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, the exhaustion getting to me. I turned back to the apartment, my footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. But as I reached the door to my bedroom, I stopped short. The door, the same door. It wasn't closed all the way. It was ajar, just a few inches, enough to make my stomach churn with unease. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure of it. I was sure I'd locked everything. But there it was. The whispering again, this time louder, more distinct. I could hear it now, clear as a bell. Come back, it said. You open the door. Now, you must finish it. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I couldn't breathe. I reached for the door, the handle cold beneath my fingertips, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. There was something on the other side. I could feel it, the same presence that had been haunting me for days. It was here, just behind the door, waiting for me to step into its world. I had to get out of here, but where could I go? The house was already inside me. Whatever had followed me wasn't going to stop just because I left. It had found me, and now there was no escaping it. With trembling hands, I backed away from the door and rushed to my coat. My keys, my wallet. I grabbed them without thinking, without planning. I had to leave, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. A sound, a soft, heavy thump. It came from the bedroom. I couldn't move. The blood drained from my face. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out, but my legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. I turned, inch by inch, and glanced toward the bedroom. The door was still cracked open, but now there was something else. A figure, a shadow. I couldn't make out its shape, but it was standing there in the doorway, watching me. The whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. It was the same feeling from before. The presence, the watching eyes. I felt it deep in my gut. It wasn't human. It was something else. I took a step back, and that's when the shadow moved. Fast. Before I could react, it darted toward me, its form now shifting in the dim light. The air grew impossibly cold, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The shadow lunged, and I screamed, slamming the door shut between us. I didn't wait. I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my ears, my hands fumbling with the locks. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out before it was too late. But as I yanked the door open, something stopped me. A voice, soft and malicious, whispered from behind me, "You can't escape." The door slammed shut with a force that nearly knocked me to the ground. The air turned frigid, and I could hear it. The footsteps, the heavier footsteps. They were moving toward me, getting closer, closer. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? It felt like time had stopped. My legs burned. My breath came in sharp gasps, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. I eventually found myself in an alley, hidden in the shadows, panting and trembling, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of my heart. The alley was cold and empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the city. And then I heard it, a soft, unmistakable noise. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the alley. It was following me. I couldn't tell you how long I stood there, pressed against the cold, damp brick wall of the alley, trying to control my ragged breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were no longer just in my mind. They were real. Someone, or something, was moving toward me, and I could hear it with excruciating clarity. I turned to look back down the alley, hoping to see nothing, hoping to hear nothing. But I wasn't that lucky. At the far end, where the shadows twisted into darkness, I could make out a shape, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing perfectly still in the blackness. It wasn't human. The outline was wrong, too elongated, shifting like a mirage in the night. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed with fear. The shadow stood motionless, but I could feel its eyes on me. It knew I was there. "Why are you running?" The voice came from the darkness, a soft, raspy whisper that felt like it was coming from inside my head. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes from the shadow. Even though I knew every moment I spent staring at it brought me closer to whatever hell it was bringing with it. "Why did you leave?" the voice continued. "You unlocked the door. You heard the whisper. You wanted this." I shook my head, my mouth dry, my heart hammering in my chest. No! No, I didn't want this. I never asked for any of it. The house, the whispers, the door, the thing that had followed me. This wasn't what I had wanted. But that voice, there was something about it, something that tugged at the corners of my mind, that dared me to understand. And for the briefest moment, I wanted to. I wanted to know what was behind that door, what had opened up the world I was now trapped in. The figure in the distance didn't move, didn't speak. It just waited, watching me. I had a choice, didn't I? I could turn away, run, leave the city entirely, never look back. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. It would always find me. It had already found me. The shadow wasn't something that could be outrun. Then, a sudden urge gripped me. Without thinking, I began walking toward it. My legs moved of their own accord, dragging me toward the shape in the dark, as if I were sleepwalking, too far gone to stop. The closer I got, the more I felt the cold creeping into my bones, a chill that made my skin tingle and my teeth ache. The whispering returned, but now it was louder, more frantic, echoing inside my skull. "Asterisk at asterisk wants you," the voice whispered. "It's already inside you." I stopped, frozen in my tracks. My eyes locked with the shadow. There was no face, no real form, just an inky, shifting mass that seemed to consume the darkness around it. Then, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, almost as if the world were tilting. I stumbled, my legs giving way, and before I could react, I felt myself falling. But not into the alley, not onto the cold concrete. No! I was falling into something else. Something darker, something that didn't belong to the world I knew. The shadows wrapped around me like hands, pulling me down, dragging me into the depths. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, my voice fading as I plummeted further into the void. The air grew thick and oppressive, the cold so intense I could barely feel my own body. My lungs burned, and my chest felt crushed under an invisible weight. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. I opened my eyes. I was in my bedroom. My bed. The apartment. I blinked, confused, unsure of what had just happened. My body felt strange, heavy, disconnected, as if I had just woken up from a nightmare that was too real to be imagined. But that's the thing, isn't it? You don't wake up from nightmares when you're still living them. I looked around the room. Everything was still and quiet. Too quiet. I sat up, my hands trembling. The room was cold, and I could see my breath in the air. But the shadows were gone. The footsteps, the figure, the whispers, they were all gone. Or at least, I thought they were. There was a knock at the door. I froze. It was soft at first, barely perceptible, like someone hesitating. Then the knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be knocking at my door at this hour? I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to see who or what was on the other side of that door. But my hand, against my better judgment, reached for the door handle. Slowly, I turned it. The door creaked open, and standing there in the threshold was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her clothes were ragged, torn as though she had been running through the night. Her hair was matted, sticking to her forehead with sweat. "Asterisk, please, asterisk," she gasped. "You have to help me." I saw it too. I heard it. The whispers. "It's coming for us. It's already inside." Her voice trailed off, and she looked past me, her gaze locking on something behind me. I turned, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. But I could feel it. The cold creeping back into the room, the pressure in the air, the faintest whisper brushing the edge of my ear. Whatever had been haunting me wasn't over. It had followed me. It had found a way in, and it was still waiting. Story 3. The house was perfect, or at least it seemed that way when I first laid eyes on it. A modest two-story with peeling white paint and a faded red door, nestled on a quiet street at the edge of town. The kind of house you don't expect much from, but somehow draws you in. Maybe it was the way the ivy climbed up the side of the house, or the way the wind rustled the trees around it, whispering old secrets I didn't care to know. I had just moved to this town, trying to start fresh after a messy divorce. I needed a place to call my own, something affordable, and this house was it. It was cheap, probably because of its age and its mysterious reputation. People had mentioned the place in passing. Little whispers, nothing concrete. I didn't pay much attention. I was desperate for a place to settle in. After all, I wasn't one to be spooked by rumors. The first night I spent there was strangely peaceful. There were creaks in the floorboards, sure, but that was normal for an old house, wasn't it? The wind howled against the windows, and the house groaned under its age, but that's what made it feel lived in. Cozy almost. It was exactly what I needed. Quiet, alone, no reminders of the past. I spent the next day unpacking, trying to make the place feel like mine. The living room was small but welcoming, with a fireplace tucked in the corner. The kitchen, though outdated, had character, with old wooden cabinets and a sink that sounded like it might fall apart with the next use. Everything had a charm to it, something old and honest. It was while I was sweeping the kitchen floor that I met Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor. She was an elderly woman, always wearing a long cardigan and thick glasses that sat low on her nose. She had a tendency to stand at the edge of her yard and watch me, which I first found odd, but I smiled and waved, hoping to be friendly. She didn't wave back the first time, but after a few moments, she did, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Good evening," she called over the fence. Her voice was raspy, as if she didn't speak much anymore. "I see you've moved into that house." I nodded, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Yes, just getting settled in." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, and she tilted her head. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" I paused, unsure how to respond. "Stories?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She leaned in a little, as if she were about to share a secret, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "About the last tenants, about the house itself." Her eyes darted to the windows of the house, and she gave a little shake of her head. "People say there's something off about it." I chuckled nervously. "It's just an old house. I'm sure it's nothing." Her face didn't change, but her gaze grew distant, as though remembering something dark. "The last people who lived there," she trailed off, her voice trembling. "One of them ran out in the middle of the night, said they heard footsteps behind them, footsteps that weren't theirs. Then they said they saw something in the window." Her eyes never met mine again, her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "You'll hear them. The footsteps, I mean. At night." I wanted to laugh it off, to assure her that it was just an old house settling. But something in her eyes made me pause. She wasn't joking, and there was something in the way she said it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to sound light-hearted as I waved her off. Mrs. Thompson only nodded, watching me closely before turning away and disappearing into her house. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, and by evening, I was too tired to think much about what she had said. I had grown used to the house creaking and groaning. It was just settling, right? That night, as I sat on the couch, eating takeout and watching a show on my phone, the quietness of the house began to feel strange. The wind howled against the windows, making the trees outside sway like twisted, skeletal arms. The old floorboards creaked under the weight of nothing, and I thought I heard a faint rustling, like someone shifting in the room above me. I froze, my spoon halfway in my mouth. It was the sound of footsteps. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just a house. Old houses make strange noises, especially when the wind's blowing like it was. I tried to focus back on my show, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were too deliberate, too rhythmic. I stood up, my heart starting to race. I knew I had locked every door before settling in for the night, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I made my way cautiously toward the stairs, half expecting to find nothing, but the creaking of the floorboards followed me, growing louder with each step I took. I paused at the bottom of the staircase, staring up into the dark hallway above. Nothing moved, no shadow passed. The house was as still as death. I let out a shaky breath and made my way back to the couch. Maybe it was just the wind after all. I tried to convince myself of that, but the feeling lingered. Something was off about this place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And so, I sat there, watching the screen, my eyes flickering toward the stairs every few minutes, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling wouldn't go away. The footsteps were still there, just waiting for me to listen. The first few days in the house felt like a breath of fresh air, at least in comparison to the small apartment I'd been living in before. It was a big, old house, way too much for a single person like me. But I'd just gotten divorced, and something about this house with its faded charm made me feel like I was turning a new page. The sun filtered through the dusty windows, and there was a quiet kind of peace in the silence that hung in the air. My only company was the occasional car passing by on the street outside. I started to fall into a routine. Every morning, I'd brew a cup of coffee in the kitchen with its chipped tiles and peeling wallpaper. I'd sit at the small wooden table by the window, looking out at the overgrown garden that needed tending but felt oddly comforting. I could hear the house creaking as I moved through it, but it was normal for an old house, right? The kind of sounds I'd heard from the floorboards, the walls, even the attic. At night, there was the soft, eerie sound of the house settling, like someone shifting around upstairs. But I knew it was just the old beams and the age of the place. On my third day, I took a walk to the neighbor's house, just a few steps down the street. I figured it would be nice to introduce myself. The house next door was a little more modern, well-kept, with a neat lawn and a swing set in the yard. It felt different from mine, newer, less haunted by the years. I knocked on the door, and a woman in her mid-40s opened it. Her smile was warm, but her eyes had a strange, distant look, like she was seeing something behind me instead of at me. "Hello," I said, holding out my hand. "I'm new to the neighborhood, just moved in." She shook my hand, but her grip was firm, almost too firm. "Nice to meet you. I'm Marie." She invited me in, and we sat down at her kitchen table. I tried to make casual conversation about the area, the weather, the usual stuff, but she kept looking over her shoulder, like she expected someone or something to be lurking there. "So," I said after a long pause, trying to steer the conversation into less uncomfortable waters. "I'm still getting used to the house. It's a little creaky, but I guess that's normal for a place this old." Marie's face grew a little paler at that. She set her coffee down and glanced out the window, almost like she was making sure no one was listening. "You'll get used to it, I suppose. But I should warn you, there's a history with that house." I raised an eyebrow. "History?" She nodded slowly, then took a long sip from her cup. The house, it has a reputation. The last tenants were a young couple. They didn't last long. You could hear them screaming at night, sometimes. At first, people thought it was just normal fighting, but it wasn't. One night, the man, he ran out of the house, babbling about curses. He was practically hysterical, and no one really saw him again. That caught my attention. What kind of curses? Marie hesitated, then leaned in closer, her voice lowering to almost a whisper. I don't know the details, but it has something to do with the house's original owner. He was obsessed with things with rituals. I've heard strange things. Footsteps when no one's there, odd smells. The house is full of old energy. Some people say it's cursed. I laughed it off, though my skin prickled a little. I'm sure it's just old house stuff. I mean, old houses creak, right? It's nothing to be afraid of. Marie didn't seem convinced. She looked out the window again, like she was lost in a memory. I hope you're right, but just be careful. Trust your instincts, and don't go up to the attic at night. I didn't know how to respond to that. I figured she was just one of those people who like to tell creepy stories to spice up their lives. But something about her tone made me wonder if she knew more than she was letting on. After that, I left with a polite goodbye and walked back to my house, my mind buzzing with thoughts. I tried to shake off what Marie had said. It had to be some kind of neighborhood folklore, right? I was probably just hearing things. Old houses had creaks and groans, and the attic was just a dusty old space. Nothing more. I didn't need to worry about curses or hauntings. But as the sun set that evening, I couldn't help but feel a chill run through me as I passed by the stairs leading up to the attic. Something about them felt wrong. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "Get a grip. You're being paranoid." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had something it wasn't ready to share with me. I decided to wait a little while before venturing up to the attic. The creaks, the shadows in the corners, the way the house always seemed a little too still. I needed time to adjust. That night, as I lay in bed, I could hear the faint sounds of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate. They didn't sound like the house settling. These were heavier, more purposeful. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just my imagination or the old timbers shifting in the night air. But the sound continued, and a sense of unease settled in my stomach. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house anymore. I spent the next couple of days trying to put what Marie had said out of my mind. I was determined not to let some spooky story from a neighbor get to me. It was an old house, full of creaks and groans. I had to remind myself that the sounds weren't anything unusual, but deep down, I knew something was off. The footsteps above me that first night, I convinced myself they were just the house settling. Old houses creak, and this one felt ancient. It was probably just the wind, and the cold spots, the drafts maybe. There had been a couple of chilly areas by the windows, but nothing I couldn't explain away. But as the days wore on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. I couldn't dismiss them as easily as I had before. It started with the temperature. I'd be sitting in the living room, reading or watching TV, when the air would turn cold, almost icy, in the span of a few seconds. I would feel a shiver race up my spine, and I'd rub my arms to warm up. But the weird part was, it would happen for a minute or so, then just disappear, like a switch was flipped. The warmth would return, and the room would feel normal again. Then there were the noises. The sounds coming from upstairs had become more frequent, almost predictable. At first, it was just light thuds, like something had fallen over. But by the end of the week, they had turned into heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like the ones I'd heard that first night. But this time, there was something else. Whispers, barely audible but unmistakable. I'd sit in the living room, the silence of the house wrapping around me, and then I'd hear it, a murmur, just beyond the range of understanding. I'd rush upstairs, heart pounding in my chest, only to find the place empty, just the way I left it. The footsteps never left any trace, and the whispers never grew louder. It was as though whatever was making the noise wanted me to know it was there, but not enough to make its presence fully known. It was impossible to deny anymore. Something was happening in this house. That Saturday, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood to clear my head. I was going stir-crazy, staying inside, and I needed a break from the oppressive atmosphere in the house. As I walked past Marie's house, I saw her standing in her front yard, chatting with another neighbor. She caught my eye and waved me over. "Hey, you're still in one piece, huh?" she said, her voice low and almost teasing. I forced a smile, not sure how to respond. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just settling in." Marie looked over her shoulder at the neighbor, then leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Listen, I wasn't kidding about what I told you before. There's something off about that place. I don't know if it's the house or what, but it's not normal." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wanted to tell her I was fine, that it was all just my nerves, that she was probably right about the house being old and creaky, but something in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't joking. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Marie glanced at the neighbor again, making sure no one else was listening. Then, in a low, almost fearful voice, she said, "The original owner, the one who built it. He wasn't just some normal guy. He was obsessed with the occult, with rituals, with things no one should mess with. People say he opened something, a door to something else. And when he disappeared, that door stayed open." I frowned, half expecting her to laugh it off, but she didn't. She just stared at me with that same intense, haunted look, as if trying to convey the weight of what she was saying. His name was Samuel Grace. He was known around here for being eccentric, for keeping to himself. But people who knew him, really knew him, said he was involved in dark things. There's a rumor that he performed rituals in the house. You can feel it, can't you? Wait, the air in there isn't like the rest of the world. I swallowed, trying to brush off the unease settling in my stomach. "You think that's what's causing the noises? The whispers?" Marie nodded. "I don't know. I can't explain it. But people say he left something behind. A curse, maybe. Something that stayed with the house. The last tenants, they were scared to even talk about it. They ran out of there like their lives depended on it. Have you ever gone inside the house? Seen anything?" I asked, unable to stop myself. Her eyes darted to the house again, then back to me. "I don't know what I've seen, but I've heard things. Strange things. But you need to decide for yourself if it's just old house noises or if it's something else. But be careful. The house takes things from people." I gave a nervous laugh, trying to dismiss the growing dread I felt in the pit of my stomach. "Thanks for the warning, but I think I'm fine. It's just an old house." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I tried to go to bed early, but the house had other plans. As soon as I turned off the lights, the air grew cold. Too cold for comfort. I pulled the blanket up higher, trying to ignore the chill that wrapped around my body like a heavy fog. The footsteps above me started again, slow and deliberate, just like before. This time, they didn't stop. They kept going, step after step, pacing back and forth, as if something was walking around in circles, waiting. And then came the whispering. It was clear now, not just faint murmurs, but words, low, guttural, and incomprehensible. My heart raced. I was paralyzed, unable to move, my body frozen in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I heard them at the foot of my bed. A cold gust of air swept over me, like a presence, something invisible yet so real I could feel it against my skin. My breath caught in my throat as the whispering grew louder, closer. Something was in the room, and it wasn't leaving. The door creaked open slowly, and I felt a weight sink onto the bed beside me, as though something was sitting there, its presence heavy and oppressive. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was too late. The room grew darker, the air thicker, and all I could do was lie there, praying for the dawn to come. I don't remember when I fell asleep, or if I even did. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and the first rays of sunlight were filtering through the curtains. The room felt normal again, no cold spots, no heavy presence. But that didn't matter. I could still feel the weight of what had happened the night before, pressing on me like a thick, suffocating fog. I got up, my body stiff from the tension that had built up during the night. My mind was racing with questions. What had happened? Was it a nightmare? No, it had felt too real. The footsteps, the whispering, the presence sitting on the bed, it was all too vivid, too tangible. I couldn't just dismiss it as my imagination. I needed answers. I spent the day trying to act normal, pushing the fear down as best as I could. I forced myself to eat, to take a walk outside, to do anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But every time I stepped back into the house, that gnawing feeling returned. The air still had that strange heaviness to it, and the creaks of the floorboards echoed in the silence like a constant reminder of the house's secrets. That evening, I decided to go back to Marie's house. I needed to know more about Samuel Grace, the man who had built this place, the man who might have opened the door to whatever was haunting me now. If there was a curse, maybe I could find a way to break it. Maybe I wasn't completely helpless. Marie wasn't home when I knocked, but her husband, Steve, answered the door. He was a big guy, with a friendly face that didn't quite match the unease that hung in the air. "Oh, hey there. You looking for Marie?" he asked, his voice warm, but his eyes darting nervously around like he didn't want to be alone. "Yeah, is she around?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "She's out with the kids," Steve said, stepping aside to let me in. "But, you want to sit down for a bit? Have a drink?" I hesitated, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Sure, thanks." Steve led me to the kitchen and poured me a glass of iced tea, the clink of the ice cubes a little too loud in the silence. He sat down across from me, but there was something in his posture, something tense, like he was waiting for me to say something. "So, you've been in that house for a little while now, huh?" he asked, his voice low and measured. I nodded, setting the glass down. "Yeah, I've been hearing things. Footsteps, whispers. That kind of stuff." Steve's eyes flickered toward the window, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "I thought you might. It's a weird place. Marie probably already told you about Samuel Grace, right?" I nodded again, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "Yeah," she did. "But what exactly happened? Why is the house so strange?" Steve sighed, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back in his chair. "I don't know how much Marie told you, but I've lived here my whole life. My dad used to tell me stories about the house, about the things that went on there when Samuel Grace was still around. We didn't know much, but there were always rumors." I leaned forward, trying to keep my voice steady. "Rumors about what?" "About Grace's obsession," Steve said, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the right words. The man was obsessed with the occult. Everybody knew it. He'd spend hours in the attic, doing God knows what. Some people said he was trying to summon something. Some people said he opened a door that shouldn't have been opened. I shuddered at the thought. "What kind of door?" Steve looked away, a strange unease crossing his face. "I don't know, but the stories weren't good. People said he'd go missing for days, then come back looking different, like he'd been changed. Then one day, he just disappeared, vanished. Nobody knows what happened to him. Some say he got taken by whatever he was messing with." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So, what happened to the house?" "No one wanted to buy it after he was gone," Steve continued, his voice growing softer. "But then, about 10 years ago, a couple moved in. Real nice people, seemed normal enough. They lasted maybe a year before they just disappeared. Left everything behind. Never saw them again. Same thing with the next tenants. And the next." I swallowed, trying to steady my breath. "And you think it's because of the curse? Because of what Samuel Grace did. Steve nodded slowly. It's not just a house. It's the land. People have always said that if you mess with the wrong things, the wrong forces, you can't just walk away from it. You can't escape what's been unleashed. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. The house, the land, the curse. It was all real. This wasn't just some string of bad luck. Something had been released. Something that was never meant to be. I looked at Steve, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what had happened, what was still out there, waiting. I've got to go, I said suddenly, standing up. Steve didn't try to stop me, but his eyes held a warning. Be careful, and don't go poking around in that house too much. Some things are better left alone. I left his house without another word, my mind spinning. I had to find out more about Samuel Grace, about the rituals he'd performed, about the curse that had been left behind. The answers were out there, and I needed them before whatever was haunting me got worse. When I got back to my house, the door creaked open as if welcoming me inside. The air felt heavy again, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps above me. But this time, I wasn't running away from it. I was going to find out what had happened, whatever it took. That night, I couldn't sleep. The idea of the house's history, the dark rituals, the whispers of the past, all of it was swirling in my head like a storm. I had to know more. I couldn't just keep pretending everything was normal. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. It was around midnight when I decided to do it. I had to search the house. I needed to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way upstairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I reached the top of the stairs, I paused. The air felt thicker here, heavier, like something was watching me. It wasn't the first time I'd felt it, but tonight it seemed stronger, more oppressive. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I moved down the hall toward the door at the end, the attic. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been inside recently. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The attic was cold, colder than the rest of the house. A sharp, musty smell filled the air, and the flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing old furniture covered in dusty sheets, boxes stacked high, and cobwebs that draped across the rafters like curtains. I moved deeper into the room, my breath shallow, my mind racing. This was it. This was where it had all started. I had to find something, some kind of evidence that would explain the strange occurrences, the fear that had been building inside me since I moved in. I began searching through the boxes, flipping through old papers and books, but found nothing of interest at first. Just old clothes, faded photographs, and dusty knickknacks that seemed to hold no meaning. I was about to give up when something caught my eye, a leather-bound journal, wedged between two old wooden crates. It looked out of place among the mundane clutter, as if it had been deliberately hidden. I pulled it out and blew off the dust, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting cramped and uneven. I began reading, my heart pounding as the words started to paint a picture of something far worse than I had imagined. The journal belonged to Samuel Grace. His entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about rituals, about opening doors to other worlds, about communing with forces that shouldn't be meddled with. His obsession was clear. The further I read, the more disturbed I became. Samuel spoke of something he had awakened in the house, something he had invited in, a presence, a shadow that lingered just beyond the veil of the living. One entry stood out among the others. I feel it now every night. It watches me. I've opened the door and it has come through. I can't close it again. It's too late. It whispers to me in the dark. The others will come. It is inevitable. I felt a chill race down my spine as I read those words. He had done it. He had opened the door, and whatever he had unleashed was still here, still waiting. I flipped through more pages, desperately trying to find a way to stop it, a way to undo what he had done. But the journal only became more incoherent as it went on. Samuel spoke of a curse, of a binding ritual that could seal the door once more. But it required a sacrifice. It required blood. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I read the last entry. Underscore, the door is open. It will never be closed. I have seen its true face. It is not a thing that can be killed, only delayed. But the time will come. It will take what it wants. Underscore, I closed the journal, my hands shaking. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I had to get out of there. I had to leave the house. But as I turned to go, I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from behind me. I spun around, the flashlight's beam cutting through the dark attic. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the dust and the shadows. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, until they were right behind me. I whirled around again, but still nothing. No one. Just the empty attic, the thick air, and the faintest whisper of movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I took a step backward. My breath caught in my throat as I turned and fled down the stairs, the footsteps following me every step of the way. I didn't look back until I reached the bottom, and when I did, I saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing at the top of the stairs, watching me. I could feel its presence, a weight in the air that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes, cold and unblinking, staring right at me. I didn't wait. I ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing, my mind spinning with terror. I stood in the yard, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The house loomed behind me, silent now, but I could still feel it, its presence, its pull. It wasn't over. It was still there, still waiting. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I could stay here anymore. But one thing was certain. I had to find a way to close that door, or it would never stop. Whatever Samuel Grace had unleashed, it would keep coming for me. And if I didn't stop it, it would come for someone else. The house was cursed. And now, so was I. I couldn't sleep that night. The fear that gripped me was too strong, too real. I tried to close my eyes, but all I could see were the dark, empty hallways of the house, and that shadow watching me from the top of the stairs. The air around me felt too still, too heavy, like something was pressing in from all sides. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let that thing have any more power over me. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. There had to be an answer, some way to put an end to it. The journal had mentioned a binding ritual. It had to be more than just ramblings from a madman. Samuel Grace had written those words with conviction, and I could sense the desperation in them. I had to find out more. I stood up from my bed, the floor creaking beneath my weight, and grabbed the journal. Its weight felt different now, heavier, as if it carried more than just words. It carried a curse, the same curse that had trapped Samuel, the same curse that was now closing in on me. I went back downstairs, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner of the house. The silence felt wrong. The house had never been this quiet. No creaking floorboards, no distant whispering. It was as though the place had gone completely still, holding its breath. I sat down at the kitchen table and began flipping through the journal again. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Maybe another clue, maybe something I missed before, but I had to try. The pages were filled with more of Samuel's ramblings about rituals, strange symbols, and cryptic references to the other side. But as I turned one last page, I found something new, a drawing, a symbol, scratched into the paper with trembling hands. It looked like an eye, but with jagged, uneven lines, as though it had been hastily scrawled. Beneath it, in smeared ink, were the words, underscore, to close the door, blood must flow. The chosen must make the offering. Only then will the gate be sealed. Underscore, my blood ran cold as I read those words. The offering, the sacrifice. Samuel had done it. He had given something up. But what had he sacrificed? And why hadn't it worked? The silence in the house grew suffocating, and I felt my skin crawl as the temperature dropped. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked toward the door that led to the basement. There was something down there. I was sure of it. It felt like the epicenter of the house's curse, the place where everything had started. I had to go down there. As I reached for the door handle, the air seemed to grow colder, and a chill ran through my bones. My breath fogged up in front of me, despite the warmth of the house. I hesitated, but some force, compelled me to open it. The basement stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended into the darkness. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows. The basement was damp, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. But there was something else now, a faint, sickly sweet scent that I couldn't place. It made my stomach churn. The flashlight flickered as I walked deeper, the light casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. I reached the far corner of the basement and froze. There, against the wall, was an old wooden chest. It was battered and worn, covered in dust and cobwebs, but there was something about it, something that made my heart race. I knew that chest. I had seen it in the journal. It was a place where Samuel had kept the things he used in his rituals. I slowly approached the chest, my breath shallow, and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of strange objects, bones, black candles, shards of broken glass, and what looked like old, yellowed pages torn from books I couldn't identify. But there, in the center of the chest, was something far worse. A small, leather-bound book, much like the journal I had been reading earlier. Its cover was cracked and stained, and when I touched it, I felt a sharp, burning sensation on my fingertips. I pulled my hand back instinctively, but something drew me to it, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I reached for the book and pulled it out. As soon as I opened it, a rush of cold air filled the room, and the flashlight flickered violently before dying altogether. The darkness pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. I felt a whisper in my ear, low and unintelligible, like a voice from far away, yet close enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The presence was here, in the room with me. I could hear it moving, a soft rustling, like something dragging across the floor. And then I heard it clearly, a laugh, a low, guttural laugh that echoed in my mind and shook my bones. Underscore, you should have never come here. Underscore, I spun around, the darkness swallowing me whole. The temperature plummeted, and the scent of decay grew stronger. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away from the chest, but something stopped me. A feeling, something pulling at me, anchoring me in place. I could feel the ground beneath me shift, as though the house itself was groaning, shifting. I wasn't alone. I could hear the footsteps now, heavy, dragging steps coming closer and closer, like something was walking toward me from the darkness. And then I felt it, cold fingers brushing my skin, creeping up my arm, tightening around my throat. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The voice came again, but this time it was clear, mocking. Underscore, you're too late. The door is open, and you are the offering. Underscore, I don't remember how I made it back upstairs. One moment, I was trapped in that basement, suffocating under the weight of a presence I couldn't see, and the next, I was standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, gasping for breath, trembling from head to toe. My hands were slick with cold sweat, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break free from my chest. But the thing that terrified me the most wasn't the dark, eerie sensation still lingering in the air, or the cold fingers that had wrapped around my throat. It was the realization that the house was alive with something that wanted me here, something that had always been waiting for someone to come along, someone like me. I stumbled into my room, locking the door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't help. The house didn't care about locks. It didn't care about anything except pulling me deeper into its web. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to watch me, to lean in closer with every breath I took. I could still hear that laugh, that mocking whisper echoing in my ears. Underscore, you're too late. Underscore, I had to get out. But where would I go? The house had a hold on me now. Even if I left, I knew it wouldn't let me go so easily. I thought of the neighbors, of the people who had lived here before me. Maybe they had felt this too, this dread, this suffocating pressure. I needed to talk to someone. I needed answers. I grabbed my phone from the bedside table and dialed the number for my neighbor, Mrs. Simmons. She'd been friendly when I first moved in, always quick with a smile and a wave. But I hadn't talked to her much since then. What could she know about the house? The phone rang 3 times before she answered. Hello. Her voice was strained, like she had been expecting my call. Mrs. Simmons, I said, my voice shaking. I need to ask you something. About the house. The one I'm renting. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her weighing whether or not she should speak. Then she sighed. I figured this day would come. What do you mean? I asked, feeling a chill settle over me. You're not the first one to ask, she replied softly. People have been coming and going from that house for years. No one stays long. It's cursed, you know. I swallowed hard. Curse? She didn't answer immediately. There was a long, tense silence, and I thought she might hang up on me. But then she continued. The last tenants were, well, they were the worst. They were good people, I think. But that house, it gets into your mind. It starts with little things. Sounds, shadows. It makes you feel like you're being watched, like you're not alone. Then it takes more. The last ones, they didn't last 6 months. One of them, Michael, the husband, he ran out of the house one night in the middle of a storm, screaming about voices in the walls. He said something was calling to him, pulling him in. He never came back. I sat frozen, the blood draining from my face. And the wife? What happened to her? Mrs. Simmons sighed. She left a week later. Didn't say much. Just packed her things and left. She mentioned something about a curse, but I thought it was just stress. I didn't think much of it. I could hear her voice shake now. But it's real. The curse. And you're right. It's been waiting for someone like you. Someone who can hear it, who can feel it. My mind raced. It was the same pattern, the same story over and over. Every tenant who stayed in this house had heard it, felt it. The weight of the curse pressing down on them until they couldn't take it anymore. But I wasn't going to be like them. I couldn't be. I had to fight back. How do I stop it? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Is there a way to break the curse? Another silence. Then Mrs. Simmons spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There is, but it's not easy. You have to find the ritual, the one that Samuel Grace performed, the one in the journal. It's the only way to close the door. The door? I asked, confused. She didn't explain further. You'll understand when you find it. You're too deep in now. You've already opened it, whether you meant to or not. It's in you, and it's waiting. The phone went dead. I stared at the screen, numb, waiting. The house seemed to pulse around me, as if it could hear my thoughts, feel my fear. The darkness was closing in, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I ran my hands over my face, trying to steady my breathing. I had to find that ritual. I had to find a way to close the door, to shut whatever had slipped through back into the darkness. But the longer I stayed in this house, the more I felt it pushing me towards something I couldn't escape. It was coming for me, and I was running out of time. There was only one place left to look, the attic. I knew the house had secrets hidden up there, things no one had seen in years. The attic was a final piece of the puzzle, the last place I hadn't yet explored. I grabbed the flashlight from my desk and headed toward the stairs. My heart thudded in my chest, and my hands trembled as I opened the door to the attic. The air smelled stale, and the stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed. The beam from the flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. I could feel it before I saw it. The weight of the house's history pressing in on me, suffocating me. The air felt thicker up here, the silence even more oppressive. I stepped inside. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, forgotten boxes, and bags of clothes that hadn't been touched in years. But there, in the far corner, was something that caught my eye. An old wooden chest, just like the one I had seen in the basement. I walked toward it, every step feeling heavier than the last, and opened the lid. Inside, there was more than I expected. Not just old clothes and forgotten trinkets, but a pile of journals. The same leather-bound books, identical to the ones Samuel Grace had written in. I picked one up and opened it to the first page. My eyes scanned the words, and as I read, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Underscore, the door is open. Underscore, I tried to convince myself that leaving the house would make it stop. I told myself that if I could just get far enough away, the whispers would fade, the cold would recede, and the heavy weight pressing on my chest would finally lift. But that's the thing about a place like that. It doesn't let you go so easily. It clings to you, wraps around you like a shadow, even when you're miles away. I didn't know where to go after fleeing the house. My car was parked just down the road, and I drove aimlessly for hours, hoping to outrun the fear, the memories. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The feeling that something, someone, was watching me from the rear-view mirror. But when I looked, it was always empty. Just the road stretching on into the night, endless and lonely. I spent the night in a small motel, but sleep didn't come. Every creak of the old building, every shift in the air, made me flinch. My phone was off. I couldn't bring myself to turn it on. I knew what I'd see if I did. The text messages I had ignored, the calls I hadn't answered. They would all be from people who cared about me, who had no idea that I was lost, swallowed whole by something beyond understanding. But the worst part was that I knew, deep down, that I couldn't escape. No matter how far I ran, the house had marked me. It had opened something inside of me, and I could feel it now, deep in my bones. The whispers had followed me. They were inside my head, a constant murmur, like a breeze brushing past my ears, always just out of reach. Underscore, leave now. Underscore, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the journal. Samuel Grace's journal. The door. The curse. How had it all started? Why had he opened the door? Was it curiosity? Desperation? Or was he drawn to it? Like I had been, like the house had called to him in the same way it was calling to me now. The thought haunted me. But worse than that, worse than anything, was a feeling that I wasn't alone. I lay in bed, my heart hammering in my chest, and every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it, feel it. The thing in the house, in the shadows, lurking just beyond the edges of my mind. Its presence was suffocating, its weight bearing down on me even in the safety of the motel room. And then, just as I was about to drift off, a cold breath whispered across my neck. I shot up from the bed, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I reached for the lamp beside the bed, my hand trembling as I turned it on. The light flooded the room, but there was nothing there. I knew what was happening. The house's influence didn't end when I left. It followed me. It would follow me until the end. I had to go back. I had to confront it. The thought terrified me, but I knew it was the only way to end this. I couldn't keep running forever. So, I packed up my things and drove back to the house. When I arrived, the house loomed in front of me, just as I had left it. Silent, still, but I could feel it, the weight of it. It wasn't the same as before, though. The air was colder. The silence was deeper. There was a tension in the atmosphere, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood in front of the door, my hand on the knob, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me in there, but I had no choice. I knew it. The house had been calling me back, and I had to finish this. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The air was thick, like the house itself was alive, watching me with unseen eyes. The faint smell of mildew and dust clung to the walls. Nothing had changed. The same old creaking floorboards, the same dim lighting. But the house felt different, heavier, darker. I took a deep breath and moved toward the stairs, my feet dragging, each step echoing through the empty house. I could hear the faintest whisper, like a breeze moving through the hall, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like the house was breathing, its very walls alive with something I couldn't understand. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The door to the attic was just ahead. I had to go up there. I had to see it again. I didn't want to, but I knew I had no other choice. I opened the door, and the room was exactly how I remembered it. The old chest in the corner, the dusty floorboards. But the air was thick with something else now, something darker, more oppressive. I approached the chest and opened it. The journal was gone. All that remained were old, yellowed papers and strange markings that I hadn't noticed before. Symbols, runes, drawn with the same ink Samuel Grace had used in his journal. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. The cold grew worse, so much worse that I could see my breath misting in front of me. Underscore, you shouldn't have come back. Underscore, the voice was soft, a whisper, but it filled the entire room. It was everywhere. It was inside my head, in the air around me. I backed away from the chest, my hands trembling as I reached for the door. But it wouldn't open. It was stuck, as if something was blocking it from the other side. Underscore, you can't leave now. Underscore, the whisper came again, clearer this time. And I realized, with sudden horror, that it wasn't just a house anymore. It wasn't just a curse. It was me. I was part of it now. It had taken me, just like it had taken Samuel Grace, just like it had taken everyone else who had stepped foot inside. The darkness in the room shifted. A figure moved toward me, its shape indistinct but growing larger, taking form. The footsteps were louder now, growing closer. It reached out for me with cold hands, and I screamed. I ran toward the window, threw it open, and leaped out into the cold night air. I didn't look back as I tumbled to the ground, my body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. I stumbled to my feet, my breath ragged, and didn't stop running. I ran through the night, through the woods, through the streets, not daring to stop. The house wasn't far behind me. It was in my mind. It was in my soul. It was with me. And now I knew it would never let me go. It was waiting, always waiting, for the next person to come along and open the door. And when they did, it would claim them, just like it had claimed me, just like it had claimed Samuel Grace. And it would never end. The house would never end. I thought I had escaped. I really did. But the truth is, once you've been touched by something like that, you can never truly leave it behind. It lingers. It festers. It becomes a part of you, crawling under your skin, filling your thoughts even when you're miles away. I tried to convince myself that I was free. The days after I ran from the house were filled with distractions, busy work, endless hours of aimless driving, nights spent in other towns, in other beds. But even then, I could still feel it, the weight of it, the house, the curse. It never let up. It was always there, in the back of my mind lurking. The worst part, the whispers, they never stopped. They followed me, no matter how far I went. They would drift through the air, just out of reach, like wind brushing my ear. Sometimes I could almost make out words, but they were never clear enough to understand. They were like the echoes of something ancient, something old and hungry. It terrified me, but I couldn't escape it. I spent the next few weeks trying to forget. I tried living like everything was normal, But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house. Every creak of the floorboards in a hotel room or an old apartment building made my heart race. Every sudden chill in the air had me turning, expecting to see something standing in the shadows. But the whispers were the worst. They were always there, in the dead of night, in the stillness when everyone else was asleep. They would start softly, like a breeze moving through the trees, just a whisper sound. But then they'd grow louder, until it felt like they were inside my head, vibrating against my skull. Underscore, you can't run from this. Underscore, I heard it again one night, a voice in the darkness, so close it felt like it was right behind me. I snapped upright in bed, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, but the air was thick with something that wasn't right. The silence felt heavy, like something was watching, waiting. I sat up, my hands trembling, my eyes darting around the room. There was nothing I could see anyway, but I could feel it. The house, the thing inside it. It was still here. It was in me. I tried to get out of bed, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, as if the very air had turned to cement. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath hanging in front of me like mist. Underscore, leave now. Underscore, the whisper again. This time, it was louder, almost desperate, like a warning. I couldn't ignore it. I had to get out of there. I had to get away. But where would I go? How far could I run? I stumbled out of the motel bed, my mind a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. I grabbed my things and ran out into the night, my legs weak and unsteady. The parking lot was empty, the lights flickering above. It was like everything was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I got into my car, the engine roaring to life, and sped off into the night. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, I could feel it. The house was still there. It was always there. I ended up at a small, run-down diner in the middle of nowhere, the only place that was open. The woman behind the counter gave me a strange look when I sat down, but I didn't care. I just needed to be around people, to remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like cardboard, and I could barely keep my hands still. Every time I looked up, I swore I saw someone standing in the corner of the diner, just out of view, a shadow that didn't belong. And then I saw it, a newspaper on the counter. The headline caught my eye. Underscore, local man found dead in old house. Police say no foul play. Underscore, the words blurred in front of me as I stared at the article. I couldn't breathe. My heart raced. The man in the story, he was from the town. He had lived in the house. The same house. The house I had left behind. The article mentioned strange noises, footsteps, things that couldn't be explained. But most chilling of all, it mentioned the man's final words. Underscore, they're still here. I can't escape. The house is awake. Underscore, I dropped the paper, my breath coming in short gasps. My hands were shaking. That's when I knew it wasn't over. It was never going to be over. The house had claimed me. It had marked me. And I could feel it again. That presence. That cold, suffocating air. I ran out of the diner, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to leave, or it would drag me back into the nightmare. But as I reached my car, I stopped. I didn't know where to go. The house was waiting. No matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I drove, it would always be there, just on the other side of my thoughts. I had no choice. I had to go back. I had to face it. But as I started the engine, I heard it again. The whisper. Underscore, it's not over. Underscore. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't sure if I could survive this. Not the way I had before. Because now, it had me, and it would never let go. I didn't go back right away. I couldn't. There was something inside me that told me, warned me even, to never go back. I tried. I really did. But with each passing day, I could feel the grip of the house tightening around me, its influence seeping into my thoughts, into my dreams. At night, the whispers would return, muffled but persistent, like the sound of something scratching just beneath the surface of the earth. It wasn't the house, I thought. It couldn't be. I had left it behind. I had. But the whispers had a way of making you doubt everything, of making you question what was real. I tried to sleep through it, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The house. It loomed in the background of my mind, always there, always waiting. And then came the dreams. They were never the same, but they all had one thing in common. The house. Every dream, every nightmare brought me back to that place. I could never escape it. In one dream, I was standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door of the room where I had first felt the presence. I reached out to open it, but something held me back, something invisible pressing against my chest. The door opened on its own, and inside was nothing but darkness. I stepped in anyway. In another dream, I walked to the garden outside, my bare feet crunching the dead leaves beneath me. The wind howled through the trees, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. I tried to turn back, but the house was there, towering over me, its windows like dark eyes staring down. And then a voice, low and guttural, whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have left." I woke up every time, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. I had never felt so terrified, so utterly powerless. I couldn't escape it. It was in my head now, like an infection that had spread too far. But the worst part, the thing I couldn't explain, sometimes, when I woke up, I could swear I heard footsteps, soft, measured steps, as though someone were walking around the room, just out of sight. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was imagining things, still too affected by the house. But deep down, I knew the house hadn't left me. It had followed me. I had to go back. There was no choice. Something was pulling me, like a tether I couldn't cut. The more I resisted, the stronger the pull became. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just exhausted, that the dreams were a result of stress or anxiety. But how could I explain the footsteps? How could I explain the cold spots in my apartment, the way the temperature would drop suddenly, only to return to normal when I moved away from them, or the strange shadows that would flicker in the corner of my eyes, vanishing the moment I turned to look? I wasn't imagining it. It was real. So, one cold morning, I packed a bag and drove back to the town. I told myself it was just to get closure, to face whatever was haunting me, to put it all behind me. But I knew that wasn't true. I was going back because I had no choice. The house wasn't going to let me go. The closer I got to it, the worse the feeling became. The air grew thick, oppressive. My chest tightened, and I found it hard to breathe. Every turn I took seemed to bring me closer to that old house, the one I had sworn to never return to. And then, there it was, looming in the distance, half hidden by the trees. The house, the same one I had fled from. Only now, it looked even worse. The windows were darker, the paint peeling off the sides like the skin of a decaying corpse. It was as though the house itself had become more alive, more aware of me. I stopped the car in front of it, my heart hammering in my chest. The door stood slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. I could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, the house groaning under its own weight. And then the door swung open all the way. I didn't know what to do. I could feel the presence inside, like a living thing breathing with me. I had come here to confront it, but now I wasn't sure I could. I wasn't sure I could face what was inside, but I had no choice. I stepped out of the car and made my way up the cracked stone path, each step feeling like it took me further from reality. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but I forced myself to open it. The air inside was cold, so cold it made my breath freeze in the air. The house seemed to exhale, a gust of wind brushing past me as I stepped inside. The smell of rot and mildew hit me immediately, but it wasn't just that. There was something else, something wrong. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been buried for a long time. I closed the door behind me, the sound of the old wood creaking, and stood there for a moment, trying to adjust to the darkness. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but I could feel it, lurking in the corners, waiting for me to make a move. Then, from upstairs, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps coming down the hall. And then, the whisper again. It's waiting. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. There was no turning back now. The house had called me, and I had answered. Whatever was waiting for me, it was inside. And I wasn't sure if I would ever leave again. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place, as if the house itself had anchored me there. The footsteps above me grew louder, nearer. They were no longer just a sound in the distance. They were right above me, right on the other side of the ceiling. The soft thud of each step reverberated through my bones, a deep, unsettling rhythm that seemed to speak directly to the fear building inside me. I should have turned around. I should have run, bolted out of the house the moment the door creaked open. But something in the air held me there. The house wasn't finished with me yet. It wasn't ready to let me go. I couldn't even hear myself breathe. The silence between the steps felt like a void, swallowing every sound I tried to make. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath in front of me, misting in the cold air. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then came the whisper, but this time it wasn't from above. It was from behind me. You should have never returned. The voice was so close, so chilling, that I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Only the same shadows stretching across the old wood floors. I strained my ears, desperate to hear something, anything, but the house had swallowed it all. There was nothing left but the cold and the fear that seemed to seep from every crevice of the walls. I backed up, away from the center of the room, pressing myself against the wall as if it could protect me. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows that seemed to move, to flicker, as if they were alive, watching me, following my every movement. It's waiting. The whisper said again, but this time it was louder. It was coming from the room at the end of the hallway, the one I had avoided before, the one I had promised myself I would never enter again. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The house had brought me here for a reason. It had been calling me back, and now that I was here, there was no escaping it. The question wasn't whether I should go in. The question was whether I would make it out. I forced myself to move, though every step felt like I was sinking deeper into the earth. My legs were weak, my breath shallow, but somehow I found myself moving forward, pulled toward that door at the end of the hallway. As I passed the doorframe, I could hear the creaking of the floorboards above me, the sound of something heavy moving. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was something worse. I pushed open the door, the creak of the hinges nearly deafening in the quiet house. The room was dark, but my eyes adjusted quickly, and I saw it. A table, old and covered with dust, stood in the center of the room. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, bottles, things I couldn't quite identify, all sitting in the darkness. But what caught my attention was a large, leather-bound book on the table, its pages yellowed with age. It was open. The whisper echoed in my mind, louder now. It's waiting for you. Open it. I didn't want to. I knew what it was asking me to do, but the curiosity, the pull of the house, was too strong. I couldn't stop myself. I walked forward, slowly, cautiously, and placed my hands on the cold surface of the table. The pages of the book turned under my fingers, each one brittle, like they hadn't been touched in years. Finally, it stopped, settling on a page with dark, scrawled words in a language I couldn't understand. But the drawings were clear. There, in the middle of the page, was a circle, a symbol. And inside that circle, a figure, twisted and unnatural, with hollow eyes staring back at me. Underscore, don't look at it. Underscore, I froze. The whisper had become a scream. I could feel it in my bones and my blood, urging me to stop, to leave. But the house, whatever was in the house, was demanding more. I slammed the book shut, but it was too late. The room grew colder, the air pressing in on me from all sides. I turned, ready to run, but something caught my ankle, tripping me. I hit the floor hard, my face scraping the wood. That's when I felt it, a cold hand, ice cold, brushing against my neck. I gasped and spun around, but there was nothing there, only darkness. Then I heard it, the whisper, louder now. Underscore, you shouldn't have left. Underscore, I stood up, heart racing, and ran for the door, the sound of footsteps growing faster, closer. I could hear breathing now, shallow, like someone or something was right behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I slammed the door open, not caring about the noise, and sprinted down the hallway, my body trembling with fear, my legs giving out beneath me. I didn't stop to look behind me. I couldn't. I didn't even know if the house would let me go. I reached the front door, hands shaking, and twisted the handle. The door wouldn't open. Underscore, it's waiting. Underscore. I tried again, pulling, pushing, but the door was stuck, as if it were part of the house, part of the curse that bound me there. The room behind me was silent now, too silent. I could hear nothing, nothing but my own frantic breathing. And then, just as I thought I would die in that house, the door swung open. I stumbled out into the yard, gasping for air, feeling the night air on my skin like a lifeline. The house loomed behind me, dark and foreboding, but I didn't stop to look back. I didn't dare. I didn't know if I was truly free. I didn't know if the house would let me go. But I didn't care. I ran. I kept running until I was far away. And then, just as I thought it was over, I heard it. A whisper. Underscore, you'll be back. Underscore.